Mr. Ethan Whitmore, please take this letter. Someone very important wants you to read it, sir. Annie Carter's voice trembled when she saw the billionaire walking out of his company. She lifted the envelope with both hands. Annie stepped forward. A security guard blocked her path before she could take another step. Miss, you can't stand here. I need to give him this letter. The guard frowned. You and half the city. Please just let me explain. It won't take much of his time. Miss, people use stories like that every day to get close to important men. Annie tightened her grip on the envelope. This is not a story. Then leave the letter at the front desk. She asked me to put it in his hands. And who exactly are you? Someone who sat beside her when no one else did. Ethan had been about to step into the back seat of a Blacktown car. At Annie's last words, he stopped. Ethan turned around, his face irritation. Why haven't you people handled this yet? Why is she making noise in the main lobby? The security guard straightened. We're taking care of it, Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore? If you don't read this, sir, you're going to regret it. And someone who is waiting for you won't be able to leave this world in peace. He looked her over. You have 10 seconds. Annie held out the envelope. It's from your mother. She wanted you to read it. Ethan did not take it. My mother lost the right to ask me for anything 30 years ago. Annie kept the letter raised. She's in the hospital. A lot of people are in hospitals. She really wants to see you. Ethan gave a short laugh. Of course she does. Annie blinked. What does that mean? It means people like you usually come with a dying mother, a tragic letter, and a request for money. I didn't ask you for money. Not yet. And you and that woman don't even know each other well enough for you to be this eager to help her. I came because she begged me. And how much did she pay you to say that? Annie looked straight at him. Nothing. She doesn't even have enough strength to hold a spoon. You may not believe me, but I would never use someone else's illness just to get attention. Ethan gave her a thin, doubtful look. That's an interesting excuse, young lady. You know what? If I believed the word of someone like you, I'd lose an entire day listening to a crowd of people telling me lies just like that. Then don't believe me, she said. Believe the letter. Ethan's eyes moved to the envelope. He turned to the guard. Get her out. The guard reached for Annie's arm. Please, she said, and she hated how small the words sounded. She doesn't have much time. Annie hesitated, then forced the words out. She's not okay. She may not make it much longer, sir. Ethan was already turning back toward the car. That was when Annie reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out the photograph. In it, a younger woman with soft eyes held a little blonde boy on her lap. The boy wore a red shirt and had one hand around her neck. Annie held it up. She told me to show you this if you wouldn't listen. The careful voice of his assistant saying, Mr. Whitmore, we're late. He stepped toward her. Where did you get that? From her. From who? Margaret. Annie lowered the picture just a little. She said you were 5. Summer of 1981. Then Ethan reached out, but not for the letter, for the photograph. Annie hesitated. You came all this way to find me, he said. Now you don't trust me with a picture? I promised her I'd put the letter in your hands. She didn't say I had to give you the only proof before you read it. What's your name? Annie Carter. And what are you to Margaret? I'm nobody, Annie said. My mother's in the bed next to hers. Ethan studied her. And you expect me to believe a stranger from a hospital became my mother's messenger? No, Annie said. I expect you to decide whether being angry is more important than being too late. Ethan finally took the envelope. Grace, he said. The woman in the navy suit stepped forward. Yes, sir? Cancel the first 20 minutes of my meeting. Mr. Whitmore, do it. Then he looked at Annie again. You're coming upstairs. Annie's heart beat hard. She should have felt relieved, but she didn't. There was something in Ethan's face that told her the letter had not saved anything yet. It had only opened a door, and behind that door was a pain older than she was. The elevator doors closed without a sound, but Annie still felt as if the whole lobby had followed her inside. Grace finally broke the silence. Mr. Whitmore, we should have legal present before you open anything. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. We don't know anything about this girl. For all we know, your mother and she could be putting on some kind of performance to gain sympathy. Annie looked at her, hurt flashing across her face before she could hide it. Please, both of you, believe me. Her condition is not good. Sometimes even breathing is hard for her. Ethan cut in before Grace could answer. I didn't bring her up here to debate her character in an elevator. Grace pressed her lips together. I'm trying to protect you. I know what you're trying to do. The claim, Grace said carefully, is serious. Ethan did not turn his head. The claim is that my mother sent me a letter from a hospital bed. His voice did not rise, but Grace stopped speaking. The elevator reached the top floor. Sit, Ethan said. Ethan placed the photograph on the desk first. Ethan turned the photo over. Ethan, my only son. Summer 1981. Ethan looked up at Annie. You're brave. Standing in a building where you could be carried out in 30 seconds. All for a woman you barely know. Annie held his gaze. You don't have to believe me. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to forgive her. But if you throw that letter away without reading it, that will be your choice, not hers. Where is she? Ethan asked. Street Mary's General, Annie said. Room 314. How long has she been there? I don't know exactly. She was moved into my mother's room a few nights ago. Your mother? Yes, sir. What's wrong with her? Annie did not know why that question made her defensive, but it did. Kidney disease, heart complications. Ethan watched her for a moment. And you just happened to become close to the woman in the next bed. I helped her with water, then with her blanket. Then she asked me to read to her. That's all? That's how it started. People don't send strangers to billionaires because someone brought them water. No, Annie said, keeping her voice steady. They do it when everyone else left them alone. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. He picked up the envelope, turned it once, and laid it back down. You understand why this looks convenient. Annie gave a tired breath. Sir, nothing about this has been convenient for me. Grace stepped forward. Annie, do you have identification? Annie opened her backpack, pulled out her state ID and hospital work badge, and placed both on the desk. You work there? He asked. Mornings. And the rest of the day? I'm with my mother. What did Margaret tell you about me? He asked. Annie looked at the envelope. Not much. That's hard to believe. She said you were her son. She said you hated her. She said you had a right to hate what you were told, but not the truth. That landed in the room and stayed there. Ethan's hand went still on the desk. What else? She asked me if a child could hate his mother forever. Annie hesitated, then added, last night, she told me, Ethan was my little boy before he became a billionaire in everyone else's eyes. Annie looked at Ethan carefully. And after every story she told me about her son, she always said she never stopped loving you. Ethan looked away first. Then he gave a faint laugh. Tell her she had years to explain. She never came looking for me. When I was 6, he said after a moment, I waited by the front window every Sunday because I thought she might come back. My grandfather told me not to make a fool of myself. He said she had chosen another life. Ethan continued, quieter now. By the time I was 10, I stopped waiting. By 15, I stopped asking. By 30, I had turned her into a lesson. What kind of lesson? Annie asked. He turned back. Never trust anyone who says they love you and then disappears. Annie held his gaze. Maybe disappearing wasn't her choice. His face hardened again, as if he regretted saying anything at all. You don't know that? No, sir. I don't. But she's lying in a hospital bed with your name on her lips. That has to mean something. It means she waited until the end. Maybe the end was the only time she had left. Grace inhaled. Mr. Whitmore. Grace. She stopped. Ethan unfolded the letter. At first, nothing changed. Grace took one step closer. Sir? Ethan did not answer. What does it say? Annie asked before she could stop herself. She says she didn't leave. Annie said nothing. She says my grandfather had her removed from the house after my father died. She says he threatened her. Lawyers. Police. Custody papers. She says she tried to come back. Grace looked stunned. Your grandfather? Ethan kept reading from the letter. She says she sent birthday cards, Christmas letters. She says she stood outside my school once and saw me on the playground. He stopped. Ethan sat down slowly behind his desk. That's not possible, he said. Annie leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, she needs to say this to you herself. My grandfather raised me. Then maybe he also lied to you. Grace said softly. Annie, she wrote my name like this when I was little, he said. His phone buzzed on the desk. Grace glanced at it. The board is waiting. Ethan did not look at the phone. Annie's own phone rang from inside her hoodie pocket. The sound made her jump. She pulled it out and saw Street Mary's General Hospital on the screen. She answered, This is Annie. Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'm with him now. She ended the call and looked at Ethan. What happened? He asked. Annie's voice came out smaller than before. It's Margaret. They said if family wants to see her, they need to come now. The office went still. Ethan looked at the letter in his hand, then at the photograph on his desk, then at Annie. For the first time, she saw fear on his face. Not fear of losing money, not fear of scandal, fear of arriving after a door had closed forever. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. And if you want to hear more emotional and inspiring stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us until the end. Ethan did not move at first. The phone call had ended. The office was quiet, and yet Annie could still hear the nurse's words inside her head. If family wants to see her, they need to come now. Grace looked from Annie to Ethan. Sir, the board is already waiting. I can move the first item, maybe delay them 20 minutes. But if you leave the building, I heard her. Grace stopped. Then what do you want me to tell them? Ethan looked down at the letter in his hand. Margaret's handwriting bent unevenly across the page, weak in places, darker in others, where the pen must have paused. He had spent most of his life refusing to say her name. Now her words were lying on his desk, and a girl he had insulted 10 minutes earlier was standing in front of him asking him to hurry before time ran out. He folded the letter carefully, but his fingers were not steady. Tell them something personal came up. Grace blinked. Personal? Yes. That is not an explanation they're used to receiving from you. Then they can enjoy the novelty. Annie held her breath. You're coming? Ethan looked at her, and the old hardness tried to return to his face. But it did not settle the way it had before. I'm not promising anything. I didn't ask for a promise. You asked me to believe a story that changes my entire life. I asked you to see a woman before she dies. That answer silenced him. Grace stepped closer, lowering her voice. Mr. Whitmore, at least let me send security ahead. If this is some kind of setup, Ethan turned to her. She works at the hospital. Her ID checks out. The call came from the hospital. And if an old woman in room 314 is part of a criminal operation, then I suppose I'll have to admire the planning. Grace did not smile. I'm serious. Suawi. He picked up the photograph and the letter, placed both inside the envelope, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Then he grabbed his phone and keys from the desk. Annie moved toward the door too quickly, almost stumbling over the leg of the chair. Ethan noticed. When did you last eat? He asked. The question caught her off guard. What? You look like you're about to fall over. I'm fine. That isn't what I asked. Annie did not answer. She did not want this man, of all people, to see one more thing missing from her life. Grace, already back in assistant mode, spoke while typing on her tablet. There's a car downstairs. Driver is waiting. Street Mary's General is about 25 minutes if traffic behaves. Traffic never behaves, Ethan said. Annie followed them into the hallway. Her phone was still in her hand. She wanted to call her mother, but Linda needed rest. And Annie did not want to explain something she barely understood herself. A few minutes ago, she had been fighting not to be thrown out of a lobby. Now she was walking beside Ethan Whitmore toward a private elevator while he carried the letter of a dying woman in his jacket. In the elevator, no one spoke. Ethan stared at his reflection in the metal doors. Annie saw a man who looked rich enough to buy any room he entered, yet suddenly trapped in one memory he could not control. When they reached the lobby, people turned to look. The same security guard who had tried to remove Annie straightened as Ethan walked past him. Mr. Whitmore, do you need? No. The guard looked at Annie. This time he did not reach for her. The black town car waited outside. Grace opened the rear door, but Ethan paused and looked at Annie. Get in. Annie hesitated. She had never sat in a car like that. The leather seats looked too clean, the dark windows too private. She slid in carefully, keeping her backpack close. Ethan sat on the other side. Grace took the front passenger seat and began making calls in a low voice. As the car pulled away, Annie looked out the window at downtown Atlanta moving past. People crossed streets with coffee in their hands. A man in a delivery uniform ran for the curb. A woman in scrubs waited at a bus stop, rubbing her eyes like she had worked all night. Annie knew that kind of tired. Ethan took the envelope from his jacket but did not open it again. He held it on his lap. "How long has she been sick?" he asked. "I don't know. She didn't tell me everything." "What did she tell you?" "That she was tired, that she had waited too long, that if you came, she didn't want to spend the time blaming anyone." Ethan's mouth tightened. "Convenient." Annie turned to him. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Turn every sad thing into an accusation before it can hurt you." Grace went still in the front seat. Ethan looked at Annie as if no one had spoken to him that way in years. "You're very direct for someone who needs my cooperation." "I don't need your cooperation for me. I need it for her." "And you think that gives you the right to judge me?" "No, sir. I think sitting beside dying people teaches you when there isn't enough time to be polite around the truth." For a moment, Ethan seemed ready to answer sharply. Then he looked away. The car slowed at a red light. On the corner, an older man sold newspapers from a metal box, though almost nobody bought them anymore. Ethan watched him without really seeing him. "My grandfather told me she left because she hated the life," he said. "The house. The expectations. Me." Annie's voice softened. "She said your grandfather told many stories." "She told you that?" "She said powerful people can make a lie sound like family history if they repeat it long enough." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Annie regretted the sentence as soon as she said it, but Ethan did not snap at her. He looked down at the envelope. "When my father died, I was 5. I remember the funeral in pieces. Black coats. My grandfather's hand on my shoulder. People bending down and telling me to be strong. I remember asking where my mother was, and no one answered me." Annie listened. "Later, I asked my grandfather. He said she couldn't handle grief. Said some people run when life gets hard. She didn't sound like someone who ran," Annie said. "You knew her for a few days. Sometimes a few days near the end are more honest than years in the middle." Ethan looked at her then, and this time the anger was tired. "How old are you?" 18. "You talk like someone older." "I don't have time to be 18. That was the first answer that made Ethan look away with shame. Grace ended a call and turned slightly. "Street Mary's has confirmed room 314. They know we're coming. I asked them not to release any information to the press." Annie frowned. "Press? Why would there be press?" Grace hesitated. "Because when Mr. Whitmore goes anywhere unexpectedly, people notice." Annie looked at Ethan. "She won't want cameras." "There won't be cameras," Ethan said. "She won't want a crowd either." "There won't be a crowd. She just wants you." The words sat between them until the car turned into the hospital entrance. Street Mary's General looked nothing like Whitmore Tower. The brick was old. The ambulance bay busy. The automatic doors scratched from years of wheelchairs and gurneys. A man in a falcon's cap smoked near the curb until a nurse told him to move. An elderly woman waited in a wheelchair with a blanket over her knees. Somewhere nearby, a child was crying. Annie opened her door before the driver could come around. Ethan stepped out more slowly, looking at the building as if it belonged to a world he had donated to but never had to enter through the front door. Inside, the lobby was crowded. People sat with paper cups of coffee, insurance folders, plastic bags of clothes. The air smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria food. Annie moved through it quickly, knowing which hallway avoided the longest line at the elevators. Ethan followed, but his pace changed. In his office, every step had seemed decided before he took it. Here, each step looked heavier. At the elevator, Annie pressed the button for the 3rd floor. "You know this place well," he said. "My mother's been here almost 3 weeks. You sleep here?" "Sometimes." "Where?" Annie shrugged. "Chair beside her bed." Ethan said nothing after that. When the elevator opened on the 3rd floor, the sound reached them first. Monitors beeping, a cart rolling, nurses speaking in low-practiced voices. Annie turned left. Ethan followed her down the hall, past rooms where families whispered and patients stared at televisions they were not watching. Room 314 was near the end. Annie stopped outside the door. For the first time since she had met him, Ethan Whitmore looked afraid to enter a room. He touched the envelope inside his jacket, then dropped his hand. Annie spoke softly. "You don't have to know what to say." He looked at her. "She just needs to know you came." Ethan stared at the closed door. His face shifted, and Annie saw the boy from the photograph beneath the suit, beneath the money, beneath the anger. Then, from inside the room, a weak voice called a name. "Ethan?" The sound was barely more than breath. But it reached him. His hand found the door handle, and this time he opened it. Margaret Whitmore was lying near the window, smaller than Ethan expected. That was the first thing that struck him. Not the tubes, not the monitor, not the thin blanket pulled to her chest, just how small she looked. In his memories, she had no real size anymore. She had become a story told by other people, then an absence, then a wound he learned to protect. But the woman in the bed was not a story. She was flesh and breath and tired eyes searching the doorway. "Ethan?" she whispered again. He stood frozen with one hand still on the door. Annie stepped in behind him but stayed near the wall. Her mother, Linda, was awake in the bed beside Margaret's. She looked at Annie first, then at the man in the suit, and seemed to understand without anyone explaining. She turned her face toward the window, giving them what little privacy a shared hospital room could offer. Ethan took one step inside. Margaret's eyes filled before he reached the bed. Her lips trembled, but she smiled as if pain had lost its place for one brief moment. "My baby," she said. Ethan flinched. The words hit him harder than he wanted them to. No one had called him that in more than 40 years. No one would have dared. He looked at the woman who had spoken them. Her hair was gray and loose around her face. Her cheeks were hollow. One hand rested on top of the blanket, blue veins showing through thin skin. That hand lifted a little, then fell back, too weak to finish the motion. Ethan did not take it. Not yet. Margaret saw that and nodded faintly, as if she had expected it. "You came. I read your letter. I hoped you would. You sent a stranger to my office. I sent the only person who was kind to me." Annie lowered her eyes. Ethan's mouth tightened. "You could have contacted me yourself." Margaret breathed in with effort. "I tried." The answer was so simple that it made him angry. "You tried? That's all?" Grace, standing just outside the door, looked uncomfortable, but Ethan did not notice her anymore. The room had narrowed to the bed and the woman in it. Margaret closed her eyes for a second. "I know what you believe." "Do you?" His voice stayed low, but the years behind it made it sharp. "Do you know what it's like to be a child waiting by a window every Sunday because someone told him his mother might come back? Do you know what it's like to stop asking because every answer makes you feel smaller?" A tear slipped down Margaret's temple into her hair. "Yes," she said, "because I was outside some of those windows." Ethan stared at her. "What?" Margaret turned her face toward him. "Not close enough for you to see me. Not long enough before they removed me. But I came." "That's not true." "It is. My grandfather said you left. Your grandfather made sure I had nowhere to stand." Ethan gave a short, bitter laugh and looked away. "He raised me. He also took you from me." The monitor beside Margaret's bed kept its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed softly at something another nurse said, and the normal sound made the room feel even stranger. Ethan shook his head. "You expect me to believe Charles Whitmore, the man who kept this family together, spent his life lying to me?" Margaret's voice weakened, but her eyes did not. "He did not spend his life lying to you. He spent mine doing it." Annie glanced at Linda. Her mother's face was still turned away, but her hand had tightened around the bedsheet. Ethan took another step toward the bed. "Why?" "Because I was not what he wanted for you." "What does that mean?" Margaret swallowed. The effort seemed painful. Annie moved automatically toward the water cup, but Ethan reached it first. He picked it up, hesitated, then held the straw near Margaret's mouth. She looked at him with such gratitude that he almost pulled back. She drank a little, then whispered, "Thank you." He set the cup down, his face unreadable. Margaret gathered her breath. "After your father died, your grandfather called me into the library. I remember the smell of cigar smoke. He was standing near the fireplace. Robert Hale was there with papers. Your grandfather said you were a Whitmore heir, and I was a woman with no family power, no money, no education that mattered to him. He said grief had made me unstable. He said if I fought him, he would prove I was unfit." Ethan's brow tightened. Unfit? He had doctors he could call, lawyers, judges who owed him favors. He said I could leave quietly, or I could be destroyed publicly. He told me if I loved you, I would not make you watch your mother be dragged through court. Ethan looked down at his hands. They had begun to curl into fists. "I don't remember any court. There was no court. That was the point. I had no money to fight him. No one would take my word over his. He gave me a paper to sign. I signed it because Robert told me if I didn't, I might never see you even from a distance. Robert Hale? Margaret nodded faintly. Yes. Ethan's face changed at the name. He's still alive. I know. You know. I followed what I could. Newspapers. Interviews. Your company reports. I knew more about your life than you think. Her mouth moved in the shape of a sad smile. I watched you become everything they wanted you to be. The sentence did not sound like praise. Ethan heard it. And what was I supposed to become? A man who did not need anyone. He looked at her then, and for a moment there was no defense ready. Margaret turned her head slightly toward Annie. She told me you still might listen. Annie looked startled. I didn't say it like that. Margaret's eyes softened. You said a child may not hate his mother forever if he knows the truth. That was close enough. Ethan looked back at Annie. She stood beside the curtain, hands folded in front of her, looking like she wished she could disappear and stay at the same time. She believes in people too easily. Ethan said. Linda spoke from the other bed without turning around. Her voice was weak but clear. No, sir. She believes after watching people carefully. There's a difference. Annie looked at her mother, embarrassed. Mama. Linda finally turned her head toward Ethan. That girl has sat in this room more nights than she should have to. She's seen pain make people mean and fear make people selfish. If she carried that letter to you, it's because she thought it mattered. Ethan did not answer. For once, he seemed to accept being corrected. Margaret's breathing grew uneven. Annie noticed first. I should get the nurse, she said. No, Margaret whispered. Not yet. Ethan moved closer to the bed, almost against his own will. You need help. I need to finish. His face tightened. Finish what? Margaret looked at him, and the years between them seemed to gather in the thin space over her blanket. I need to say I am sorry. Ethan's eyes flashed. For what? According to you, none of this was your fault. For being afraid. For signing. For believing men with money knew more about your future than your mother did. For every birthday I watched pass with a card in my purse because I could not get it through the gate. For every Christmas I told myself you were warm and fed, while I was sitting in a room alone wondering if you remembered my face. Ethan swallowed. Margaret lifted her hand again. This time he saw it. This time he took it. Her fingers were cold. I remembered, he said, and the words seemed to surprise him. Not clearly, but I remembered your perfume, and a song. Margaret's eyes widened a little. What song? He looked away, ashamed of the softness in his own voice. You used to sing it. When there was thunder. Margaret began to cry, not loudly. She did not have the strength for that. Tears simply slid down both sides of her face. You are my sunshine, she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes. For 1 second, he was not 50 years old. He was 5, in a red shirt, pressed against a woman's chest, while rain hit a window, and a voice told him he was safe. When he opened his eyes, Margaret was still looking at him. I didn't leave you, she said. His grip tightened around her hand. I know, he said, but the words broke on the way out. Margaret heard them anyway. Annie stepped back closer to her mother's bed, giving the moment room. Linda reached out beneath her blanket, and Annie took her hand. Ethan leaned closer to Margaret. The anger had not vanished. It was still there, but it no longer knew where to go. What do you want from me? He asked. Margaret studied his face, as if memorizing the man and the boy at once. Nothing you can buy. That hurt him more than an accusation would have. What then? Don't let hate be the only thing your grandfather left you. Ethan lowered his head. Outside the room, Grace quietly canceled the rest of the morning. Inside, Annie watched a man who had walked into the hospital as a billionaire sit beside a dying woman as a son. And for the first time since Margaret had arrived in room 314, she was no longer waiting alone. Margaret's hand stayed inside Ethan's for several quiet minutes. No one rushed them. Even the machine seemed to understand that some moments needed to pass without being interrupted. Ethan sat in the chair Annie usually used when she read to Margaret. It looked too small for him, too ordinary, but he did not seem to notice. His thumb rested against the back of Margaret's hand, not quite stroking it, just holding on as if he feared she might disappear if he loosened his grip. Margaret looked at him the way mothers look at grown children when they are trying to find the little boy under the man. You have your father's eyes, she whispered. Ethan gave a small, broken breath. I don't remember him much. He loved you. My grandfather said he was weak. Your grandfather called kindness weakness whenever it got in his way. Ethan looked at her. Was my father kind? Margaret's mouth softened. Too kind for that house. That was the trouble. Annie stood beside Linda's bed, listening though she tried not to. The curtain between the beds had been pulled halfway, but the room was too small for secrets. Linda squeezed Annie's fingers once, not to stop her from listening, but to remind her she was still there. Ethan leaned closer. Did he know grandfather wanted you gone? No. Your father died believing we would raise you together. Margaret blinked slowly. The first week after the funeral, your grandfather behaved like a grieving old man. The second week, he behaved like the owner of everything left behind. Ethan looked toward the floor. Margaret's breathing grew rough for a moment. Annie reached for the call button, but Margaret shook her head as much as she could. Please, Margaret said. Let me speak while I can. Ethan turned sharply toward the door. Where is the doctor? Grace stepped inside. I can get someone. No, Margaret said, firmer than before. Doctors can give me minutes. I need to use the ones I have. Ethan closed his eyes, fighting himself. Don't talk like that. I have to. You came, Ethan. I prayed for that. But I did not ask Annie to find you, only so I could be forgiven. His eyes opened. Margaret shifted her gaze toward Annie. Come here, child. Annie hesitated. Miss Margaret, this is your time with him, and I want you in it. Annie moved closer, still holding Linda's hand until the distance made her let go. She stood near the end of Margaret's bed. Margaret looked at Ethan. This girl sat beside me when I had no one. She worked all morning, cared for her mother, then came back and asked if I needed water before she asked if she needed rest. Do you understand what kind of heart that is? Annie's face warmed. I didn't do anything special. Yes, you did, Linda said quietly from the other bed. Ethan looked at Annie, and for the first time there was no suspicion in his eyes. Only discomfort, the kind people feel when they realize they misjudged someone and must stand in the shame of it. I was cruel to you, he said. Annie looked down. You were angry. That doesn't excuse it. No, sir, but I understand it better now. Margaret smiled faintly. That is what I mean. Ethan turned back to his mother. What? She has mercy before people earn it. That is rare. Ethan's face tightened. I don't know if I have any of that left. You do. It is buried under what they taught you. What if I don't know how to dig it out? Margaret's hand moved weakly inside his. Start by not becoming your grandfather when you are hurt. Those words struck him in a place Annie could see. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if something heavy had shifted. A nurse entered after a soft knock. She was in her 50s, with reading glasses hanging from a cord and the steady calm of someone who had helped many families through their worst hour. Miss Whitmore, she said gently, I need to check your vitals. Margaret nodded. Ethan stood, but Margaret held his hand. Stay. The nurse worked around him without comment. She checked the monitor, adjusted the oxygen, listened to Margaret's chest, and glanced toward Annie with a look Annie understood. It was not good. Ethan understood it too. How long? He asked. The nurse did not answer quickly. It's hard to say, but you should stay close. Ethan nodded once. His face had gone still again, but this time stillness was not coldness. It was restraint. After the nurse left, Grace stepped into the doorway. Mr. Whitmore, I've cleared your schedule until 3. I can move the rest of the day if needed. Move it. All of it? Yes. Grace looked at Margaret, then back at Ethan. Of course. Margaret watched Grace leave, then looked at her son. You always did sound like your grandfather when you gave orders. Ethan almost smiled, though it hurt too much to become one. That isn't a compliment. No. He lowered his head. I don't know how to undo 40 years. You don't undo them. You stop adding to them. Annie felt that sentence settle into the room. Linda did too. She opened her eyes and looked across at Margaret with the tired respect of one woman recognizing another woman's truth. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter. There are things in here I need to verify. Margaret nodded. You should. Robert Hale. Yes. He helped him? He held the pen. Ethan's jaw tightened. Where are the letters you sent? I don't know. Some were returned. Some disappeared. Some I gave to guards because they promised they would deliver them. They didn't. No. He looked at the photograph on the bedside table, the one Annie had carried across the city. "Why did you keep this one?" "Because that day was mine. No one could rewrite it if I held the proof." Ethan picked up the photo. His fingers touched the edge carefully. "I remember the shirt," he said. Margaret's eyes brightened. "You spilled orange soda on it after the picture." He stared at her. "And you cried because you thought I would be mad," she said. "I told you shirts could be washed. But little boys should not be scared of mistakes." Ethan's mouth trembled before he pressed it closed. Annie turned away slightly, giving him what privacy she could. But Linda watched him, and her own eyes filled. Maybe every mother in that room knew the shape of what had been stolen. Margaret's breathing became shallower. Ethan noticed and sat back down. "Mom," he said, the word cautious, almost unfamiliar. Margaret closed her eyes as if she had waited decades just to hear it. "Yes, I believed them. I know. I hated you. I know. I don't know how to carry that." Margaret opened her eyes. "Then don't carry it alone." He bent forward, still holding her hand. "I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. "So am I." There were many things that could have been said after that, but none of them would have changed the years. So Ethan stayed beside her, and Margaret looked at him as if memorizing his face would be enough to make up for the time she had lost. Annie moved back to her mother's bed. Linda reached for her. "You did good, baby," Linda whispered. Annie shook her head, tears slipping down before she could stop them. "I just gave him the letter." "No," Linda said. "You carried a mother's voice when hers was almost gone." Across the room, Margaret heard enough to smile. Then she looked at Ethan again. Her voice was weaker now. "There is one more thing." Ethan leaned close. "Tell me." Margaret's eyes moved to Annie. "Promise me you will not let that girl lose her future because she was kind to an old woman." Annie froze. "Miss Margaret." Margaret did not look away from Ethan. "Promise me." Ethan turned and looked at Annie, really looked at her. The old hoodie, the hospital badge, the tired face of a girl who should have been in a classroom instead of living between work shifts and medical bills. Then he looked back at his mother. "I promise," he said. Margaret relaxed as if that one word had eased something inside her. For a while, no one spoke. Ethan held her hand. Annie sat beside Linda. Grace stood outside the door, making quiet calls. The afternoon light shifted across the floor. Near sunset, Margaret opened her eyes once more. "Ethan, I'm here." She smiled, barely. "You came." His voice broke. "Yes, Mom, I came." Her fingers moved once inside his. Then the monitor changed. The nurse came in quickly, then slowed when she saw Margaret's face. Ethan did not let go of his mother's hand. He kept holding it, even after the nurse lowered her eyes and turned off the alarm. No one in room 314 said anything for a long time. Ethan bowed his head over Margaret's hand, and the man who had once believed money could protect him from every kind of pain learned that some losses arrive quietly, sit beside you, and ask only to be felt. Annie watched through her tears. She had delivered the letter. She had kept her promise, but as Ethan sat there beside the mother he had found only to lose, Annie understood that the letter had not ended the story. It had only told him where to begin. The hospital moved on because hospitals always did. A nurse closed Margaret's curtain halfway. Someone down the hall asked for ice chips. A doctor's pager sounded. The cleaning cart squeaked past room 314 as if nothing had changed. As if a mother had not just spent her final breath holding the hand of the son who had been taught to hate her. Ethan stayed seated long after the nurse left. His hand still held Margaret's, though her fingers had gone still. Annie did not speak. Linda did not speak. Even Grace, who seemed built from schedules and decisions, stood outside the doorway with her phone lowered, saying nothing to anyone. At last, Ethan placed Margaret's hand gently on top of the blanket. He did it with care, almost fear, as if one careless movement might erase the few minutes they had been given. "I need a moment," he said. His voice was rough. Grace stepped back. "Of course." Annie turned toward her mother's bed. Linda's eyes were wet, but she was watching Ethan with a mother's sorrow, not a stranger's curiosity. "Annie," Linda whispered. Annie came close and took her hand. "You all right?" Annie shook her head. "I don't know." Linda looked toward the curtain. "That poor woman waited a lifetime. I got there too late." "No, baby. You got there before the door closed." Annie swallowed hard. She wanted to believe that. She had brought Ethan. She had kept the promise. But watching Margaret die made the promise feel smaller than the loss. Behind the curtain, Ethan stood. The sound was slight, just the scrape of a chair leg. When he stepped out, something had changed in his face. Not softened exactly. More like stripped down. The man who had entered room 314 carried money, anger, suspicion, and a lifetime of wrong answers. The man leaving it looked as if most of those things had been taken from him, and he had not yet learned what remained. He looked at Annie. "I owe you an apology." Annie wiped her face quickly. "You don't have to do that now." "Yes, I do." Grace glanced at him, surprised. Ethan stood near the foot of Linda's bed, not too close, as if he had finally learned that not every space belonged to him. "I judged you before you finished speaking. I insulted you. I assumed you wanted something." Annie looked down. "Most people assume that when someone like me walks into a place like yours." He did not defend himself. That mattered. "I was wrong," he said. Annie nodded once. "Thank you." The words were simple, but Linda watched them as if they were larger. To her, an apology from a man like Ethan Whitmore to a girl like Annie was not small. It was a crack in a wall that had stood too long. Ethan turned to Linda. "Miss Carter." Linda adjusted herself slightly against the pillow. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry this happened in your room." "This is a hospital," Linda said. "Hard things happen in every room." He accepted that quietly. Grace stepped in. "The hospital needs to know about arrangements. I can speak with administration." Ethan's jaw moved. "No, I'll do it." "Sir, I can handle." "I said I'll do it." But when he looked toward the nurse's station, Annie saw uncertainty. He had signed billion-dollar contracts, but he did not know how to claim a mother he had only just received back. Annie stood. "I can show you where to go." Ethan looked at her. "You've done enough. I know the desk, and they know me." For a moment he looked like he might refuse out of pride. Then he nodded. They walked out of room 314 together. Grace followed a few steps behind but gave them space. At the nurse's station, the charge nurse, Miss Alvarez, looked up and saw Annie first. Her face softened. "Oh, honey." Annie's throat tightened. "This is Mr. Whitmore, Margaret's son." The nurse's expression changed with recognition, then with something more personal. Not because of Ethan's name, but because she had seen Margaret waiting day after day. "I'm sorry for your loss, sir," Miss Alvarez said. Ethan stood very still. "Thank you. There will be some forms. We can give you a quiet room." He nodded, but his eyes moved back toward room 314. Miss Alvarez lowered her voice. "She asked about you often." Ethan looked at her. "She did?" "Yes, sir." "Not in a way that made trouble. Just your name. Sometimes. When the pain was bad. When she was half asleep." The nurse glanced at Annie. This young lady was the one who stayed with her most. Ethan looked at Annie again, and this time the gratitude was harder for him to hide. In the small consultation room, Miss Alvarez placed a folder on the table and explained what needed to be done. Next of kin. Funeral home. Personal belongings. Hospital release. Ethan listened carefully, asking only necessary questions. He signed where she pointed, his handwriting sharp but slower than Annie expected. When the nurse left, Grace entered with a notepad. "I can contact a funeral director," she said. "There are several we've used for foundation events." Ethan looked at her. "Not foundation events. Grace. My mother." Grace lowered the notepad. "I'm sorry." He leaned back in the chair and rubbed his forehead. "I don't even know what she would have wanted." Annie spoke quietly. "She liked gospel music." Ethan looked at her. "She asked my mama to play some on her phone sometimes. Old songs. Not loud. She said it reminded her of Sundays before life got complicated." "Do you know which songs?" Annie nodded. "A few." Ethan's eyes lowered. "Write them down for me." "I will." "What else?" "She didn't like lilies. Said they smelled like people trying too hard." Grace looked up despite herself. Annie almost smiled, but it faded quickly. "She liked yellow roses," Annie added. "My mama said they looked cheerful." Miss Margaret said cheerful was something a room had to fight for. Ethan turned his face away, but not before Annie saw his eyes shine. "Yellow roses," he said. Grace wrote it down. The door opened softly, and Miss Alvarez returned with a clear plastic belongings bag. Inside were Margaret's few possessions: a worn sweater, a small Bible, reading glasses, a paperback novel, and a cloth pouch. Ethan stared at the bag. That's all? The nurse's face was gentle. That's all she had with her. Annie knew that look on his face. It was not only grief. It was shame. He owned towers with his name on them, and his mother had left the world with one plastic bag. Miss Alvarez set it on the table and left. Ethan reached for the cloth pouch. His fingers paused before opening it. Inside were several folded papers, a thin gold chain, and a stack of old photographs held together with a rubber band. He lifted the first photo. A younger Margaret stood outside a small house, holding baby Ethan. In another, Ethan sat in grass with orange soda on his shirt. In another, he slept against her shoulder. Ethan touched the edge of that picture. She kept these, Annie said. She looked at them every night. He closed his eyes briefly. Under the photographs was a folded envelope with his name on it, but this one had not been sealed. Ethan opened it. Inside was a short note. He read it silently, then passed it to Annie without saying why. The note said, "If he comes too late for forgiveness, tell him I forgave him before he knew he needed it. If he comes in time, let me say it myself." Annie handed it back. Ethan's voice was low. "She forgave me before I even showed up. She was your mother," Annie said. He looked at her. "Is it that simple?" "No, but maybe that's why it's true." For a long while, Ethan said nothing. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen and ignored it. It rang again. Grace checked hers. "It's Robert Hale's office," she said. Ethan's face changed. Annie noticed. "Who is that?" Grace answered before Ethan could. "Family attorney. Retired mostly." Ethan stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. Then he picked it up and called back. Grace stiffened. "Sir?" Ethan put the phone to his ear. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled again. But this time control had a purpose. "Robert, it's Ethan. My mother died today." Silence. "Yes, Margaret." Another silence. Ethan's eyes hardened. "I have her letter, I have her photographs, and now I have questions." Annie watched him from across the table. "No," Ethan said. "Not tomorrow, not next week. Today." He ended the call. Grace held his gaze. "What did he say?" Ethan placed the phone on the table. "He said my grandfather did what he thought was necessary." The room went cold. Annie understood then that Margaret's death had not closed the wound. It had opened the investigation. Ethan gathered the letter, the photographs, and the small Bible into the belongings bag with careful hands. Then he stood. "Grace, cancel the day. All of it. Have the car brought around." Grace nodded. "Where are we going?" Ethan looked at the note Margaret had left him. "To find out how many people helped steal my mother from me." Ethan did not ask Annie to come with him. At first, she thought that was the end of her part. She had delivered the letter. She had brought him to the hospital. She had watched Margaret die holding her son's hand. Now Ethan Whitmore was going to step back into his world of private cars, old lawyers, family estates, and rooms where people spoke in careful sentences over expensive tables. Annie belonged in room 314, beside her mother. But when Ethan reached the hallway, he stopped and looked back. Annie. She was standing near the nurse's station with Margaret's empty water cup still in her hand. She had picked it up without thinking. "Yes, sir." He looked at the cup, then at her face. "You don't have to come. But some of what we may find belongs to the woman who trusted you. If you want to stay with your mother, I understand." Annie glanced toward room 314. Linda was resting. Miss Alvarez had promised to check on her. Annie wanted to stay. She also wanted to run from all of it, to sit beside her mother and pretend the day had not become larger than anything she knew how to carry. Then she thought of Margaret's note. "If he comes too late for forgiveness, tell him I forgave him before he knew he needed it." Margaret had trusted her with more than a letter. She had trusted her with the last honest bridge between a mother and a son. "I'll come," Annie said, "but I need to tell my mother." Ethan nodded. "Of course." Linda was awake when Annie returned to the room. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. "You going with him?" "For a little while." Linda studied her daughter. "You don't owe that family anything." "I know." "Then why?" Annie looked at the curtain around Margaret's empty bed. "Because Miss Margaret did." Linda reached for her hand. "Keep your phone on." "I will." "And Annie?" "Yes, ma'am?" Don't let rich people make you feel small just because their rooms are bigger. Annie managed a weak smile. I'll try. Linda squeezed her fingers. Don't try. Remember. The car was waiting at the hospital entrance when Annie stepped outside with Ethan and Grace. The afternoon had turned gray, and a light rain had begun to fall. Ethan held Margaret's belongings bag on his lap during the ride, not handing it to Grace, not setting it on the seat beside him. Annie noticed that. It was the first thing he had carried for his mother himself. Where are we going? Annie asked. Whitmore Estate, Ethan said. Grace turned from the front seat. Robert Hale is meeting us there? He said he would. He didn't sound willing. He doesn't need to be willing. Annie watched the city change beyond the window. The hospital district gave way to wide roads, older neighborhoods, then streets lined with trees and long driveways. The houses grew larger and farther apart. By the time they reached the iron gates of Whitmore Estate, Annie understood something she had not fully understood before. Margaret had not simply been pushed out of a house, she had been pushed out of a kingdom. The gates opened slowly. The car drove up a long, curved driveway toward a stone mansion with white columns and windows tall enough to make any person standing beneath them feel temporary. Annie stepped out carefully. Rain dotted her hoodie. Ethan looked at the house for a long moment before moving. This is where you grew up? Annie asked. Yes. It doesn't look like a place a woman could be thrown out of easily. Ethan's mouth tightened. That's the point. Houses like this don't throw people out. They make it look like people chose to leave. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and old money. A housekeeper in her 60s came into the foyer and stopped when she saw Ethan's face. Mr. Whitmore? Mrs. Bell, we need access to the archive room. Her eyes flickered toward Annie, then back to Ethan. To her credit, she did not ask questions. Yes, sir. I'll get the key. Grace removed her coat and checked her phone. Robert says he's 10 minutes out. Ethan looked up the staircase. Annie followed his gaze. At the top landing hung a large portrait of Charles Whitmore Sr. He had silver hair, a hard mouth, and the kind of eyes that seemed to judge people even after death. That's him? Annie asked. My grandfather. He looks like he expected everyone to apologize for breathing too loudly. For the first time that day, Ethan almost smiled. You're not wrong. Mrs. Bell returned with a brass key. She led them down a back hallway to a room Annie would have missed if she had been alone. It was not grand like the front of the house. It was narrow, windowless, lined with cabinets, shelves, and file boxes labeled by year. Ethan stood at the threshold. Grace looked at him. Sir? He entered. They started with the years after Ethan's father died. Grace read labels aloud. 1,980. 1,980. 1. Legal correspondence. Estate transition. Household staff. Ethan pulled down a box marked personal, EW minor records. The label made Annie uncomfortable, as if the boy from the photograph had been turned into property. Inside were school forms, medical records, letters from boarding schools, birthday guest lists. Ethan searched with growing impatience until Annie noticed a smaller envelope tucked behind a folder. Mr. Whitmore, she said. He took it from her. Across the front, in old blue ink, was written, For Ethan, 6th birthday. Ethan did not open it right away. Grace had gone still. Annie spoke softly. You should. He slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a card with a small cartoon dog wearing a party hat. A folded note fell onto the table. Ethan opened it. His face changed as he read. What does it say? Grace asked. Ethan's voice was low. She says she hopes I still like red toy cars. She says she's sorry she can't bring my present herself. She says birthdays are proof a mother was once lucky enough to meet her child. Annie looked away. Ethan searched the envelope again. There was a store receipt, faded but readable, for a toy car bought in Atlanta 3 days before his birthday. Grace whispered, It was kept here. Ethan placed the card down as if it might tear under the weight of his hand. Then they found more. A Christmas card, a note for his 7th birthday, a short letter written after he broke his arm at school. Though Ethan had no memory of anyone telling Margaret about it, a small school photograph clipped from a newsletter, folded and worn at the edges from being touched too often. Each one had been kept. None had reached him. Annie watched Ethan's anger change shape. It was no longer aimed at a mother who had died. It was turning toward the house itself, toward the portrait in the hallway, toward every quiet drawer that had held back the truth. Mrs. Bell appeared at the door. "Mr. Hale is here." Ethan did not look up from the letters. "Bring him in." A few minutes later, Robert Hale entered the archive room with a cane in one hand and a raincoat over his arm. He was old, but not fragile. His white hair was neatly combed, his suit expensive, his eyes cautious. "Ethan," he said, "I'm sorry about Margaret." Ethan lifted one of the birthday cards. "Don't say her name like you have the right." Robert's mouth tightened. "You're grieving. This is not the time." "This is exactly the time." Grace stepped aside. Annie stayed near the table, unsure whether she should leave. Ethan seemed to sense it. "Stay," he said without looking away from Robert. Robert's eyes moved to Annie. "And who is this?" "The person who brought my mother back to me before she died." Robert looked uncomfortable. "This is a family matter." Ethan's voice sharpened. "Then speak honestly in front of the only person in this room who acted like family to her." Robert went quiet. Ethan spread the letters across the table. "How many did you intercept?" Robert looked at the cards, then at Ethan. "Your grandfather made decisions he believed were necessary." Ethan stepped closer. "I asked how many." Robert exhaled slowly. "I don't remember." "That's a lie. It was more than 40 years ago. You remember enough to call me today and defend him." Robert gripped his cane. "Charles was protecting the Whitmore name." "From my mother?" "From instability." Annie saw Ethan's hand curl into a fist. Robert continued, choosing his words like a lawyer even now. "Margaret was emotional. She had no resources. Your father's death left things uncertain. Charles believed your upbringing required structure. My upbringing required my mother." Robert looked down. Ethan picked up the 6th birthday card. "She came back, didn't she?" Robert did not answer. "She stood outside the gate. Outside my school. She sent letters. She sent gifts. And you helped keep them from me." Robert's silence became the answer. Annie felt cold despite the warm room. Ethan's voice dropped. "Say it." Robert looked at him sharply. "I want to hear one honest sentence from you before I decide what kind of man you are." For a long moment, only the rain against the windows spoke. Then Robert Hale lowered himself into a chair as if his bones had finally admitted their age. "Yes," he said. "She tried to come back." Ethan did not move. Robert stared at the table. "Your grandfather ordered the staff not to admit her. He had me draft a legal notice warning her to stay away. He said if she continued, he would have her declared unstable and unfit. He believed money could create a cleaner life for you than love could." Annie looked at Ethan. His face had gone pale. "And you?" Ethan asked. Robert's voice weakened. "I held the pen." No one spoke after that. Ethan looked down at the letters his mother had written, the proof of years he had been taught to misunderstand. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "My mother died today believing she had to apologize for being afraid of men like you." Robert closed his eyes. Ethan gathered the letters carefully, one by one. "She was wrong," he said. "You were the ones who should have been afraid." Robert opened his eyes. "Of what?" Ethan looked at him. "The truth." Robert Hale stared at Ethan as if the word had landed somewhere he had spent his life avoiding. "The truth," Robert repeated, almost under his breath. "Yes," Ethan said. "Not the version my grandfather paid for. Not the version you filed away in language no child could question. The truth." Grace stood by the archive table with her tablet lowered. She had worked for Ethan for 9 years and had seen him negotiate with governors, CEOs, and men who thought money made them untouchable. But she had never seen him like this. He was not loud. He did not need to be. The room was already full of every letter Margaret had sent and every silence that had kept them hidden. Robert shifted in his chair. "You should think carefully before you do anything public. Your grandfather is gone. Margaret is gone. Dragging this into daylight won't give you those years back." "No," Ethan said, "but keeping it buried would make me part of what took them." Robert looked at Annie. "This girl has no idea what a family name can carry." Annie had been quiet, but she lifted her eyes. "Maybe I don't, but I know what a mother's name carries after people lie about her." Robert's mouth tightened. "Young lady, this is more complicated than you understand." Annie held his gaze. "People always say that when the simple truth makes them look bad." Grace looked down, hiding the smallest reaction. Ethan did not hide his. Robert leaned back. You brought a bold one with you. She brought my mother, Ethan said. You helped take her away. The room went still again. Robert's hand trembled on the cane. But whether from age or shame, Annie could not tell. Ethan placed the 6th birthday card in front of him. I want a written statement. Dates. Names. What my grandfather ordered. What you drafted. What happened to the letters. What was threatened. Everything you remember. Crate. End. Of Lurie. I cam. Ender. A letters. I want. A letters. Robert shook his head slowly. You are asking me to incriminate myself. I'm asking you to tell the truth before someone else has to drag it out of you. I was an attorney. There are privileges. There are also crimes. Coercion, fraud, abuse of process. Maybe more, depending on what those papers say. Robert looked at Grace. Grace finally spoke. Mr. Hale, I'm not your attorney. But if you're asking whether this can remain contained, I would not count on it. There are letters, internal notes, security logs, and now your verbal admission in front of witnesses. Robert's eyes moved to Annie. She is not a witness. She is a stranger. Ethan's voice sharpened. She is the reason I'm sitting here with my mother's letters instead of letting you die with the truth in your pocket. Robert's face lost some color. Annie saw then that old powerful men were still men. They aged. Their hands shook. Their voices thinned. And sometimes the things they buried waited patiently until someone young and tired carried them back into the room. Robert looked at the letters spread across the table. Charles believed Margaret would weaken you. Ethan gave a bitter breath. She was my mother. He thought love made men soft. My grandfather mistook cruelty for strength. Robert did not answer. Ethan pulled out his phone and set it on the table. Grace, call our general counsel. I want an independent review, not Whitmore internal, outside firm. Full access to family records involving Margaret Whitmore from the year my father died onward. Grace nodded. Yes, sir. Robert looked alarmed. Ethan, listen to me. Once you open this, you cannot control where it goes. Ethan looked at the old man. That is the first honest thing you've said. Robert leaned forward. The board will panic. The press will turn this into a scandal. Your grandfather's charitable legacy, the foundation, the hospital wings, the scholarship programs, all of it will be questioned. Good. Good? Yes. If a legacy can't survive the truth, it deserves to be questioned. Annie looked at him then. It was the first time she understood Margaret's final wish had not only been about one son visiting one mother. Margaret had wanted Ethan to see the room where the lie had been built. She had wanted him to choose what kind of man would walk out of it. Robert was silent for a long time. Rain tapped at the windows. Somewhere in the house, an old clock chimed the hour. Finally, he said, There is a file. Ethan did not move. Where? Robert looked toward the cabinets. Not here. Where? In my office. A private box. Charles instructed me to keep it off the estate records. Grace's fingers paused over her tablet. What's in it? Ethan asked. Robert swallowed. Copies of the legal notice. Correspondence between myself and Charles. Notes from household security. Some returned letters. A signed agreement. Signed by whom? Margaret. Annie felt her stomach tighten. Agreement for what? Robert looked at her, then away. That she would not attempt contact with Ethan without prior approval from Charles Whitmore or his legal representative. Ethan's voice went low. And how did you get her to sign it? Robert closed his eyes briefly. We told her continued contact could result in a petition questioning her mental stability and fitness. We told her public proceedings would harm the child. The child, Ethan repeated. You mean me? Yes. You used me to threaten her. Robert had no answer. Ethan stood so quickly the chair moved back against the floor. Annie flinched, but he did not shout. He walked to the shelves and braced both hands on the edge of one cabinet, head lowered. Grace spoke carefully. Mr. Whitmore. He did not turn. Arrange a car for Mr. Hale. He's going to his office with us. Robert stiffened. I am not sure. You just told me there is a file proving my mother was forced out of my life. You can walk us to it. Or I can have counsel subpoena it by morning. Robert looked older than he had 10 minutes before. You've become very much like Charles when you want something. Ethan turned around. No, he said. Charles used power to silence a woman who had none. I'm using mine to hear her. Annie felt those words in her chest. Robert lowered his eyes first. They left the archive room with Margaret's letters placed carefully in a document box Grace found on a shelf. Ethan carried the box himself. Annie walked behind him, thinking of room 314, the plastic bag of belongings, the yellow roses Margaret would never see. The house around them felt less grand now. Its polished floors and tall portraits seemed like props in a play that had gone on too long. As they passed the portrait of Charles Whitmore Sr., Ethan stopped. For a moment, he looked up at the painted face of the man who had raised him. Annie expected anger. Instead, she saw grief. You taught me to hate the wrong person, Ethan said quietly. No one replied. He walked on. Outside, the rain had become steady. Robert got into Grace's car. Ethan and Annie sat in the back of the town car again, the box of letters between them. Annie looked at it. She kept loving you through all of that. Ethan did not answer at once. His hand rested on the lid of the box. I spent years thinking love was something people said before leaving. Annie watched the rain slide down the window. Maybe for her, love was what made her keep trying after they made leaving the only thing she was allowed to do. He looked at her. You really did listen to her. She didn't have many people to talk to. That should never have been true. No, Annie said. It shouldn't. The car pulled away from Whitmore Estate and followed Robert's sedan through the wet streets. Grace had already sent calls ahead. Lawyers would be waiting. Files would be pulled. Men who had once believed paper could bury a mother were about to learn paper could also raise her voice. Ethan opened the document box and took out one birthday card. He read the first line again, silently. Then he closed it and looked at Annie. After we get the file, I need to go back to the hospital. To my mother's room? To arrange my mother's service. And to speak with your mother. Annie grew cautious. About what? About the promise I made. You don't have to do anything today. Yes, Ethan said, looking down at Margaret's letters. That's what everyone told themselves 40 years ago. Annie had no answer. The car turned onto the road toward Robert Hale's office. The sky above Atlanta was low and gray. But Ethan sat straighter now. Not healed. Not close to it. But moving. For the first time all day, Annie thought Margaret might have known exactly what she was doing when she placed that letter in the hands of a girl nobody powerful had expected to believe. Robert Hale's office was on the 4th floor of an old brick building near Buckhead, the kind of place that did not need a sign to tell people important men had worked there for a long time. The lobby smelled of leather chairs, floor polish, and old paper. Annie followed Ethan and Grace past a receptionist who stood too quickly when she saw Robert enter with them, rain still shining on his coat. Mr. Hale, the receptionist said, looking from his face to Ethan's. Is everything all right? No, Ethan said before Robert could answer, but it will be more honest by the time we leave. Robert gave him a tired look and led them down a hallway lined with framed certificates. Annie noticed how many names were written in gold. How many pictures showed Robert shaking hands with judges, governors, and men who looked like they had never waited in a hospital billing office. She wondered how many lives could be bent by people who smiled in photographs. Robert unlocked a private office at the end of the hall. It was neat, too neat, with shelves of law books and a large desk that seemed made to put distance between people. He crossed to a cabinet behind the desk and paused with one hand on the handle. Ethan said, "Open it." Robert did. Inside were rows of files, some labeled, some not. He reached behind the second row and pulled out a narrow gray box with no writing on the lid. Dust marked the top. He set it on the desk but did not open it. Grace placed her tablet on the table and began recording notes. For the record, Mr. Hale, are these documents related to Margaret Whitmore? Robert's eyes sharpened. Are you recording me? No. Taking notes. If you want this done formally, I can have counsel here in 15 minutes. Robert looked at Ethan. Ethan said, "Open the box." Robert removed the lid. For a moment, no one touched anything. Inside were folders tied with aging string, several envelopes, a copy of a legal notice, and a small brown package wrapped in paper. Ethan reached first for the legal notice. He unfolded it and read in silence. Annie watched his face. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Ethan did not look up. A warning. It says Margaret was not to approach the Whitmore residence, school grounds, or any location where I was expected to be present. unless approved in writing by Charles Whitmore Sr. or his legal counsel. Grace's mouth tightened. On what grounds? Robert answered without looking at her. Emotional instability, potential disruption of the minor child's environment. Annie felt sick. She was a mother trying to see her son. Robert's voice was low. That was not how Charles framed it. Ethan lifted another page. And you signed this. I drafted it. You signed it. Robert looked at the paper. Yes. Ethan placed it down carefully, as if his anger needed order or it would break something. Grace pulled on a pair of gloves from her bag, the kind she used when handling old corporate records. She separated the folders. There are returned letters here. Ethan reached for them. One was addressed in Margaret's handwriting to Master Ethan Whitmore. The postmark was from December 1982. The front was stamped "Return to Sender." No such recipient at this address. Ethan stared at that line. I lived there, he said. Robert closed his eyes. Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was a Christmas card with a snowman on the front. The writing was careful. My dearest Ethan, I do not know if you remember the song I sang when storms came. I still sing it on nights when I miss you most. I hope someone lets you laugh today. I hope someone tells you you are loved. Merry Christmas, my sweet boy. Mama. Ethan's hand went to his mouth. He did not cry, but Annie saw him hold something back with effort. Grace's eyes were wet. She turned away under the pretense of checking another folder. Ethan opened another letter, then another. Birthday cards, Christmas notes. A letter written after Ethan started first grade. A note congratulating him on a school award Margaret had read about in a local paper. Every letter said some version of the same thing. I am here. I remember. I love you. None had reached him. Annie looked at Robert. How could you keep these? Robert sat down slowly. I told myself I was following instructions. That's what people say when they don't want to call it choosing. Robert looked at her, and for once he had no lawyer's answer. Ethan picked up the brown package. The paper cracked slightly as he opened it. Inside was a red toy car, still in its box, the plastic window yellowed with age. He stared at it. Annie remembered what Margaret had said through Ethan's letter. She had hoped he still liked red toy cars. Ethan held the box in both hands. I asked for one like this. Robert said nothing. I remember asking. My grandfather gave me a silver watch instead. Said toys were for boys who had nothing better to become. Annie looked at the little car and thought of a 6-year-old boy who should have been allowed to play. Ethan set it down. His voice changed. It became quieter, more dangerous. What else is in here? Grace opened the final folder. An agreement. Ethan took it. The paper was several pages long. Margaret's signature sat at the bottom, uneven and pressed hard into the page. Ethan read through the clauses. Annie could not understand the legal language from where she stood, but she understood his face. She agreed not to initiate contact, he said. Not to challenge custody. Not to make public statements. Not to appear near the home, school, or social functions. Robert said, under threat of court action. Ethan looked at him. Under threat of being declared unstable. Yes. Was she unstable? Robert's mouth opened, then closed. Ethan stepped closer. Was my mother unstable? No. The word was small, but it filled the office. Ethan nodded once, as if something inside him had finally found the shape of the lie. Say the rest. Robert looked old now, not dignified, just old. She was poor. Grieving, frightened. Charles believed she could be pressured. I helped pressure her. Annie's hands closed around the strap of her backpack. Ethan pointed to the letters. Did my grandfather read these? Some, and he still kept them from me. Yes. Why keep them at all? Robert looked at the box. Charles never destroyed things that might be useful later. He believed paper was control. Grace said quietly. Then paper can correct the record. Ethan turned to her. Scan everything. Today, outside counsel gets copies. I want originals secured. Robert straightened. You cannot just take files from my office. Ethan looked at him. They concern my mother and me. If you want to argue ownership, do it in writing. But understand something, Robert. I am done asking permission from men who used paperwork to steal my childhood. Robert's face flushed, but he did not stop him. Grace began organizing the documents. Annie helped without being asked, sliding envelopes into careful stacks by date. Ethan noticed her handling each letter gently, as if Margaret might feel it. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." "Then why?" "Because somebody should have treated these like they mattered." Ethan lowered his eyes. When the scanning was arranged and the documents placed into secure folders, Robert walked them to the door. He seemed smaller than when they arrived. At the elevator, he spoke to Ethan. "Your grandfather was not a monster every day." Ethan looked at him. Robert continued, "That is what makes men like him hard to judge. He could be generous, loyal, brilliant. He built hospitals, paid tuition, helped families, and then he could destroy one woman because she stood between him and the future he wanted." Ethan's answer was quiet. A man does not get to buy goodness in bulk and spend cruelty in private. Robert looked away. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sidewalks were still wet. Ethan stood by the car with the document box in his hands. He seemed unable to set it down. Grace asked, "Back to the hospital?" "Yes," Ethan said. Then he looked at Annie. "Your mother should hear from you first. I don't want to walk into her room with decisions she hasn't been prepared for." Annie grew cautious. "What decisions?" "The promise I made to Margaret." "Mr. Whitmore, my mother doesn't like charity." "Neither do I," Ethan said. "Charity is easy. This is responsibility." Annie did not know what to say to that. On the drive back, Ethan kept one letter open on his lap. It was the Christmas card. He read it again and again, not like a businessman reviewing information, but like a son trying to hear a voice before it faded. Annie looked out at the city. Cars moved through puddles. A man carried groceries in a plastic bag. A woman held a child's hand at a crosswalk. Ordinary lives kept going, even while Ethan's past rearranged itself beside her. After several minutes, he spoke. "She said she hoped someone told me I was loved." Annie turned to him. "My grandfather told me I was strong," Ethan said. "Successful, prepared, never loved. Not like that." Annie thought of Linda, sick and tired, still finding ways to call her baby. "She wanted you to know." "I know now. It still counts." He looked at her. "Does it?" "Yes," Annie said. "Late love still counts. It just hurts more." Ethan looked back down at the letter. The car pulled up to Street Mary's as evening settled over the hospital. The windows glowed yellow against the gray sky. Ethan held the box of his mother's stolen years in both hands and followed Annie inside. This time, he did not walk like a man entering a place beneath him. He walked like someone returning to the last room where the truth had been alive. Room 314 looked different when they returned. Margaret's bed had been stripped. The thin hospital blanket was gone. The pillowcase changed. The curtain pulled back as if the space had already been prepared for someone else's pain. Only the chair beside the bed remained where Ethan had sat, slightly angled toward the empty mattress. Annie stopped at the doorway. She had known hospitals moved quickly. She worked there. She had watched rooms turn over before families finished crying in the hallway. Still, seeing Margaret's bed empty made her chest tighten. Linda was awake, sitting higher against her pillows. She looked at Annie first, then at Ethan, then at the document box in his hands. "You found something," Linda said. Ethan stepped inside slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Linda's eyes moved to the empty bed. "About Miss Margaret?" "Yes." Annie went to her mother's side. "Mama, are you okay?" "I'm here." Linda reached for her hand. "That's enough for tonight." Ethan stood at the foot of Linda's bed, holding the box like it weighed more than paper. "I don't want to disturb you," he said, "but I made a promise to my mother before she passed, and I'd like to speak with both of you about it." Linda gave him a tired but steady look. "If it's about money, Mr. Whitmore, I need you to understand something before you start. My daughter didn't do what she did to be paid. I know that. She's not a story you can use to make yourself feel better." Annie looked embarrassed. "Mama." "No," Linda said gently. "Let me say it." Ethan did not interrupt. Linda continued. "People with money sometimes think kindness from poor folks is something they can purchase after the fact. Annie has been giving away pieces of herself since I got sick. I won't have anyone making her feel like she owes them gratitude for noticing." Ethan accepted the words without offense. That surprised Annie more than if he had argued. "You're right," he said, "and I'm sorry if I came in here sounding like that." Linda studied him for a moment. "All right." Ethan set the document box on the small table near the wall, away from the medical tray, as if he understood this room was not his office. My mother asked me not to let Annie lose her future because she was kind to her. Annie lowered her eyes. She shouldn't have asked you that. She had every right to ask. I didn't help her for help back. I know. Ethan's voice was calm, but there was something behind it now that had not been there in the lobby. Not pity. Annie could have refused pity easily. This was harder. It sounded like respect. He looked at Linda. May I sit? Linda nodded. He took the chair beside Margaret's empty bed. The choice was not lost on anyone. For a second, his hand rested on the armrest where he had gripped the chair while his mother died. I went to my family estate, he said, then to Robert Hale's office. We found letters, birthday cards, legal notices, an agreement they forced my mother to sign. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Lord have mercy. They kept her from me, and they kept me angry enough not to look for her. Annie watched him speak. His face was controlled, but the control was thinner now. I can't repair that, Ethan said. Not for her, not for me, but I can decide what happens next. Linda's gaze sharpened. And what happens next? First, my mother's name will be restored publicly and legally. I'll have a statement prepared after outside counsel reviews the documents. I won't let anyone call her unstable or unfit again. Second, I'm establishing a fund in her name to help parents who are pushed out of their children's lives because they don't have money for lawyers. Annie looked at him. She would like that. I hope so. Linda nodded slowly. That's good. But you said you wanted to talk about Annie. Yes. Annie felt her shoulders tense. Ethan turned to her. Grace checked with the hospital billing office while we were at Robert Hale's office. Annie looked up quickly. You did what? Grace, standing near the door, spoke carefully. Only after Mr. Whitmore asked what was legally appropriate. We did not access private medical details beyond what your mother would need to approve. I spoke with administration about general billing support options. Annie's face warmed. That's our business. It is, Ethan said, and I won't force anything on you. Linda said, but you came prepared. I did. Linda almost smiled. Rich men usually do. Ethan took that without flinching. Your current coverage is not enough for long-term treatment. That doesn't mean you failed. It means the system asks families to survive with one hand tied behind their backs and then calls them careless when they stumble. Linda's expression changed a little. She had expected pride to defend her. She had not expected him to name the thing plainly. Ethan continued. Whitmore Foundation already funds patient support through several hospitals. St. Mary's is one of them. I'm expanding that support effective immediately. Your treatment can be covered through that program, with your consent, not as charity to Annie, not as payment for a letter, as medical assistance your family qualifies for and should have had access to before tonight. Annie shook her head. That sounds too clean. It isn't. It's paperwork and approvals and people who should have made it easier before you were sleeping in chairs. Linda looked at Annie. Baby. Annie felt tears coming and fought them. She was tired of crying in front of him. I don't want her to feel like we traded Miss Margaret's pain for help. Ethan leaned forward. You didn't trade anything. You gave my mother what my family denied her, someone willing to listen. I'm not paying you for that. I'm making sure the consequences of your goodness don't crush you. Linda was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, what about school? Annie turned. Mama. Linda ignored her. She was accepted into the nursing program. Had to defer. Ethan looked at Annie. Nursing? Annie wiped her cheek. I wanted to. Before your mother got sick. Yes. Grace checked her notes. Atlanta Community College nursing program? Annie stared at her. How did you? Your hospital badge listed your education volunteer hours, Grace said, almost apologetic. I made an educated guess and called no one. Ethan said, if you want to return, the Margaret Whitmore Scholarship will cover tuition, books, transportation, and living support for students caring for sick family members. You would be the first recipient, but not the last. Annie could not speak. Linda did it for her. And if she says no because she's stubborn? Ethan looked at Annie, and a faint sadness crossed his face. Then I'll respect it. But I hope she understands refusing help doesn't make the people who love her safer. Sometimes it only makes the burden heavier. Linda squeezed Annie's hand. Hear that? Annie looked at her mother. You're supposed to be on my side. I am. That's why I'm telling you not to be proud in a way that punishes you. Annie laughed once through tears, small and unwilling. Ethan looked toward Margaret's empty bed. My mother spent 40 years alone because people with power made her believe she had no choice. I don't want anyone else in this room living under a burden just because it was handed to them. Annie followed his gaze. The bed was empty, but Margaret's presence still seemed to sit in the space between them. What happens to her? Annie asked. My mother? Annie nodded. I'll arrange a service. Yellow roses, gospel music, no cameras, no corporate speech. His voice lowered. And I'll be there as her son, not as Ethan Whitmore. Linda nodded. That would please her. Ethan looked at Annie. Will you help me choose the songs? Annie swallowed. Yes. Grace's phone buzzed. She stepped out quietly to answer it. For a while, the three of them sat in the low light of room 314. Outside the door, the hospital continued with its ordinary griefs. Inside, something had shifted. Not solved, not healed, but named. Ethan stood at last. Miss Carter, I'll have the hospital administrator come by tomorrow with the foundation coordinator. Nothing moves without your approval. Linda gave him a look that was still cautious but no longer closed. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Ethan, he said, please. Linda considered that. All right, Ethan. He turned to Annie. Get some rest tonight. Annie almost laughed again. In this chair? Ethan looked at the chair, then at Linda, then back at Annie. We'll fix that too. She started to protest, but Linda raised a hand. Annie Carter, let one thing be easy. Annie closed her mouth. Ethan picked up the document box. At the door, he paused and looked once more at Margaret's empty bed. I found your letters, he said softly. Annie and Linda heard him, but neither answered. He added, I'm sorry I didn't look sooner. Then he left the room with Grace following behind him. Annie sat down beside her mother, no longer able to stand. Linda brushed a hand over her daughter's hair the way she had when Annie was small. You kept your promise, Linda whispered. Annie looked at the empty bed. No, she said. I think Miss Margaret kept hers. Linda's hand stilled. What promise? Annie leaned back in the plastic chair, exhausted to the bone. That love would find him, even if she had to send it through somebody else. By the next morning, Annie woke with a stiff neck and her cheek pressed against the sleeve of her hoodie. For a few seconds, she did not know where she was. Then the sounds came back. The monitor beside Linda's bed, the cart in the hall, the nurse asking someone 2 rooms down if they had eaten breakfast. Room 314 had returned to its ordinary rhythm, except for the empty bed by the window. Annie looked at it before she could stop herself. The mattress had been made. The pillow sat flat and clean. There was no water cup on the table now, no paperback novel, no small hand reaching toward the call button. Margaret was gone, and the hospital had already prepared the space for the next person who would need it. Linda was awake, watching her. You slept crooked, she said. Annie rubbed her neck. That chair hates me. That chair has been begging you to go home for 3 weeks. I don't listen to furniture. Linda smiled, but it faded when she followed Annie's eyes to the empty bed. She really is gone, Annie whispered. Yes, baby. Annie sat up, pulled her knees close, then remembered she was not a child anymore, and put her feet on the floor. It feels wrong that everything keeps going. That's how grief starts, Linda said. The world keeps moving before your heart agrees to it. A nurse came in with Linda's morning medication and a small tray of food. Oatmeal, toast, fruit cup, coffee. Linda was not allowed to drink, but always sniffed as if smelling it counted. Annie helped adjust the tray. You need to eat too, Linda said. I will. When? When somebody invents a breakfast I can afford. Linda gave her a look. Before Annie could answer, there was a knock at the open door. Grace Miller stood there with a woman in a gray blazer and a man carrying a folder. Grace looked less sharp than the day before, as if she had slept little and thought much. Good morning, Grace said. May we come in? Linda glanced at Annie, then nodded. Come on. Grace introduced the woman as Karen Wells, the patient support coordinator for Whitmore Foundation's hospital program. The man was from St. Mary's administration. They spoke gently, not quickly, and Linda listened with the wary attention of a woman who had signed too many forms without knowing what they would cost later. Karen sat near the foot of the bed. Miss Carter, nothing changes without your consent. The program can cover outstanding balances related to your current treatment and assist with ongoing care. We'll explain every document before you sign. Linda looked at Annie. Hear that? Explain every document. Annie nodded, though she was looking for the trap. Years of being poor had taught her that good news usually came with small print. Karen seemed to understand. You can take time. You can have another person review it. We can also connect you with an independent patient advocate. Linda's shoulders eased a little. That sounds fair. Grace looked at Annie. Mr. Whitmore also asked me to bring this. She handed Annie a paper bag from a diner down the street. Annie opened it and smelled eggs, grits, and a biscuit with butter folded into wax paper. Annie frowned. He sent breakfast? He said hospital coffee and vending machine crackers don't count as food. Linda laughed softly. The man ain't wrong. Annie wanted to refuse on principle, but her stomach made the decision before her pride could. She took the biscuit out. Tell him thank you, she said. He's downstairs, Grace replied. Annie looked up. Linda raised an eyebrow. Then you can tell him yourself. Annie found Ethan in the small chapel near the hospital lobby. He sat in the back pew with Margaret's document box beside him and the red toy car in its yellowed package resting on his lap. The chapel was plain. Wooden cross, stained glass window, a few hymnals, a bowl of prayer cards near the door. Ethan did not look like he belonged there, but he looked less out of place than he had in room 314 the first time he arrived. Annie stood at the end of the pew. Grace said you were here. Ethan looked up. I didn't want to crowd your mother's room. She's talking to the coordinator. Good. Annie sat a careful distance from him. Thank you for breakfast. You look like someone who argues with meals. I only argue when they come with strings. No strings. She looked at the toy car. You brought it back? I didn't know what else to do with it. Maybe keep it. I was thinking about putting it with her for the service. Annie considered that. She bought it for a little boy. Maybe the grown man should keep it. Ethan looked at her, then back at the box. I don't know how to be that boy anymore. You don't have to be him. Just don't throw away what was meant for him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm holding a service tomorrow morning. Small, no press. Yellow roses. The songs you wrote down. Annie nodded. She liked His Eye is on the Sparrow. My mama played it for her twice. It's on the list. She also liked when the nurses joked with her. Said hospitals needed laughter because pain already had enough room. Ethan let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. That sounds like her. You only knew her yesterday. He looked at her. That's the part that keeps finding new ways to hurt. Annie did not answer right away. In the front of the chapel, a candle flickered, though no one seemed to have lit it recently. Ethan said, I met with outside counsel early this morning. The documents from Robert Hale are being reviewed. There will be a public correction about my mother. Not today. I want the service first. But soon. Will people believe it? Some will. Some won't. People like a clean villain or a clean saint. My grandfather was neither. But my mother deserves the truth on record. She deserves more than that. Yes, he said. She does. Annie studied him. What happens to Robert Hale? That depends on counsel. He signed a preliminary statement last night. I think he did it because he's old enough to fear judgment more than court. Is that enough? No, but it's a beginning. She nodded. Ethan turned the toy car in his hands. I keep thinking about all the Sundays I waited. I thought she didn't come. She did. I know that now. Knowing doesn't fix the waiting. No. Annie leaned back against the pew. She had not meant to stay long, but the chapel was quiet in a way the hospital rooms were not. Ethan looked at her. Grace told me you almost refused the patient program. I didn't refuse. I suspected. That's a fair distinction. My mother doesn't like owing people. Do you? No. Then don't think of it as owing me. That's easy for you to say. It is, he admitted. But I mean it. My family used money to close doors. I can use it to open a few. Annie looked at him then. Money can open doors, but people still have to walk through without being made to feel small. Ethan absorbed that. You'll tell me if that happens? I'm not your conscience. No, he said, but you seem to be good at interrupting it. Despite herself, Annie smiled. The chapel door opened, and Grace stepped in. Sorry, the funeral director is here. They need a final decision about the flowers. Yellow roses, Ethan said. Grace nodded. I told them. They asked if you want white lilies as well. Annie shook her head immediately. Ethan noticed. No lilies, he said. Grace's eyes softened. No lilies. After Grace left, Ethan stood and picked up the document box. Annie, he said, I'd like you and your mother at the service, if Linda feels well enough. Only if you want to come. She would want to. Your mother? Margaret, Annie said. She would want someone there who knew she liked yellow roses and hated lilies. Ethan nodded, and for a moment his face showed relief so plain that Annie looked away to give him privacy. When Annie returned to room 314, Linda was signing the first set of forms with Karen explaining each line. Annie stood in the doorway and watched her mother write her name slowly but firmly. For the first time in weeks, Linda was not looking at a bill like it was a sentence. She was looking at it like there might be a way through. That afternoon, Annie took the bus home for the first time in days to shower and change. The apartment felt smaller than she remembered, with dishes drying by the sink, mail stacked on the table, and Linda's sweater still hanging over the back of a chair. Annie stood in the quiet and cried harder than she had allowed herself to cry at the hospital. She cried for Margaret, for Ethan, for her mother, for herself, for every person who had ever been told to carry too much, and be grateful it was not heavier. Then she washed her face, found a clean black dress in the closet, and ironed it with careful hands. The next morning, she and Linda would attend Margaret Whitmore's service, and Annie had the feeling that when Ethan stood beside that casket, he would not only be burying his mother, he would be burying the lie that had kept her from being loved out loud. The service was held in a small chapel on the east side of Atlanta, not in one of the grand churches where the Whitmore name appeared on donor plaques. Ethan had chosen it after Grace read him 3 options, and Annie quietly said Margaret would have liked a place where people did not feel afraid to cry. The chapel had wooden pews, a plain cross, and windows that let in soft morning light. Yellow roses stood near the casket. No lilies, no cameras, no reporters, no company banners, just a few hospital staff members, Grace, Robert Hale in the back row, Annie, Linda, and Ethan. Linda had insisted on coming. Though the hospital had sent a wheelchair and a nurse to help, Annie sat beside her mother, one hand resting on the handle of the chair. She wore the black dress she had ironed the night before. It was not new, but it was clean, and Linda had smoothed the shoulders before they left room 314. Ethan stood near the casket before the service began. The red toy car sat beside a framed photograph of Margaret as a young woman holding him in her arms. He had decided not to bury the toy with her after all. Annie had been right. It had been meant for the little boy, but he placed it there for the service, so everyone would know she had remembered him. The pastor, an older black man with a gentle voice, opened with prayer. He did not speak as if he had known Margaret for years. He spoke honestly, saying some lives passed through the world quietly, and some wounds were never visible until the truth was allowed to stand near them. Then a woman from Street Mary's sang, "His eye is on the sparrow." Her voice filled the small chapel without forcing itself into any corner. Linda closed her eyes. Annie looked at the yellow roses. Ethan looked at the casket and did not move. When the song ended, the pastor invited Ethan to speak. For a moment, Ethan did not step forward. Grace looked worried. Annie did not. She had seen that same hesitation outside room 314. The fear before a door. This was another door. Ethan walked to the front with a folded paper in his hand, but when he reached the lectern, he did not open it. "My mother's name was Margaret Whitmore," he began. His voice was steady, but low. "I spent most of my life saying that sentence as little as possible. When I did say it, I said it with anger. I believed she left me when I was a child. I believed she chose a life without me. I believed that because people I trusted told me it was true." Robert Hale lowered his head. Ethan continued. "Yesterday, I learned that my mother tried to reach me. She wrote letters. She sent cards. She came to gates and schoolyards. She was turned away by people who had power over her and over me. The chapel was silent except for Linda's careful breathing. I cannot give her back the years that were taken. I cannot give myself back the boy who waited by the window. But I can stand here today and say this clearly. Margaret Whitmore did not abandon her son." His voice changed on the last word, and he had to pause. Annie saw Grace wipe her cheek quickly. Ethan looked at the photograph beside the casket. "She loved me when no one let her say it. She remembered things no one else remembered. A red shirt, orange soda, a song during thunder. She carried a mother's love in silence because men with money convinced her silence was the price of protecting me. He looked toward Annie then, and she did not die alone, because a young woman named Annie Carter saw her. Annie lowered her eyes, but Linda squeezed her hand. Ethan said, Annie did not know my mother's last name when she first helped her. She did not know there was a letter. She did not know there would be anything asked of her. She simply saw an old woman alone in a hospital bed and treated her like she mattered. That should not be rare. But too often. It is. He paused again. My mother's last request was not for money or revenge. She asked me not to let Annie lose her future because she had been kind. I intend to honor that. More than that, I intend to honor what my mother's life taught me too late, that power without mercy can turn a family into a prison, and truth delayed is still truth owed. Robert's hands tightened around his cane. Ethan finally opened the paper, looked at it once, then folded it again. Mom, he said, and the words seemed to cost him and heal him at the same time. I am sorry. I know you forgave me before I knew enough to ask. But I am asking now. He stepped back from the lectern. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder for one brief moment, the way older men do when words are not enough. After the service, people came forward quietly. Miss Alvarez from Street Mary's hugged Annie and spoke to Ethan. She was peaceful at the end, the nurse said. Ethan nodded. Thank you for caring for her. She made it easy, Miss Alvarez said. She was polite even when she was hurting. That tells you something about a person. Yes, Ethan said. It does. Robert Hale waited until most people had stepped away before approaching. Annie saw Ethan's body stiffen. Ethan, Robert said, this isn't the place. I know. Then choose another time. Robert swallowed. I only wanted to say that hearing you speak of her. I should have stopped him. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Yes. You should have. Robert nodded as if he deserved nothing softer. I signed the full statement this morning. Grace has it. I know. I included the names of the guards, the physician Charles kept on retainer, and the judge he threatened to involve. Ethan's face remained controlled, but Annie saw the impact. More names meant more truth. More truth meant the lie would not die quietly. Why now? Ethan asked. Robert looked toward Margaret's casket. Because she is dead, and I am old, and those are poor reasons, but they are the honest ones. Ethan did not forgive him. Annie could tell. But he did not strike him with words either. Then be useful while honesty still matters to you, Ethan said. Robert lowered his head and walked away. Linda watched from her wheelchair. That man looks like he just found out regret has a weight. Annie murmured, Mama. What? It does. Ethan came over then. Miss Carter, thank you for coming. Linda looked at the casket. She deserved witnesses. She did. Linda tilted her head. You spoke well. I spoke late. Late is not the same as never. Ethan accepted that with a nod. Grace approached, holding a folder. The foundation board approved the emergency expansion this morning. Karen can begin the process for Linda's treatment as soon as you're ready. And the scholarship documents are drafted. Annie stiffened. Today? Grace looked apologetic. Not for you to sign today. Just ready when you are. Ethan turned to Annie. There is no pressure. Annie glanced at her mother. Linda said, Don't look at me like I'm going to rescue you from a blessing. It's a lot. It is, Ethan said. Take time. Annie looked toward Margaret's photograph. She really asked you to do this. She did. She barely knew me. She knew enough. Linda smiled faintly. Old women in hospital beds see more than people think. For the first time all morning, Annie let out a small breath that almost became laughter. A few minutes later, Ethan asked Annie to walk with him to the front of the chapel. He picked up the red toy car from beside the photograph and held it out. I'm keeping it, he said. Good. But I wanted you to see something. He turned the box over. On the back, in Margaret's faded handwriting, was a small note Annie had not noticed before. For Ethan, when they let me come home. Annie covered her mouth. Ethan stared at the words. She thought there would be a day. She had to. Yes, he said. I suppose she did. He placed the toy car inside his coat pocket. Outside the chapel, the morning had warmed. The rain from the day before had left the pavement clean and dark. Grace helped Linda into the medical transport van while Annie stood near the steps, watching Ethan speak briefly with the pastor. When he came back, he did not look like a healed man. He looked like a man who had chosen not to hand his pain back to the people who caused it. "Annie," he said, "tomorrow I'm meeting with council about the public statement. After that, I'd like to visit Street Mary's again. If your mother is feeling up to it, I want to discuss the scholarship with both of you properly." Annie nodded. "Okay. And Annie?" "Yes, sir." "Ethan." She hesitated, then said, "Ethan." He seemed to hear more in that than a name. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For standing in my way." Annie glanced toward the street, remembering the lobby, the guard, the way his voice had cut her down before he knew her. "You didn't make it easy." "No," he said. "I didn't. But you listened eventually." He looked back at the chapel. "I wish I had learned that sooner." Annie thought of Margaret, of room 314, of the letter, of a mother who had used her last strength to reach a son who had been trained not to reach back. "Sooner would have been better," Annie said. "But yesterday was still in time." Ethan nodded slowly. As Annie climbed into the van beside Linda, she looked through the window and saw Ethan standing alone on the chapel steps, one hand inside his coat pocket where the red toy car rested. For once, he did not look like a billionaire waiting for the world to move around him. He looked like a son learning how to carry love after the person who gave it was gone. The public statement went out the next afternoon, not from a stage and not with reporters shouting questions, but as a written release from Whitmore Industries and the Whitmore Foundation. Ethan had insisted on that. Margaret's name had spent too many years trapped inside other people's noise. He wanted the first correction to be clear. Grace sent Annie a copy before it became public. Annie read it on her phone beside Linda's hospital bed, moving slowly through each line. Margaret Whitmore, mother of Ethan Whitmore, was separated from her son under circumstances involving coercive legal pressure, family interference, and the withholding of personal correspondence. Records recently recovered confirm that Mrs. Whitmore attempted contact repeatedly over the years. The Whitmore family acknowledges the harm caused by those actions and will take steps to correct the public and private record. Annie stopped reading when her eyes blurred. Linda watched her. "What does it say?" Annie swallowed. "It says she didn't leave him." Linda closed her eyes. "Good. It says they're starting a fund in her name. That's good too." Annie looked at the empty bed by the window. A new patient had not been moved in yet. For once, room 314 had a little silence. She should have been alive to see this. Linda turned her head toward the window. "Maybe. But some women spend their whole lives planting trees they never sit under. Doesn't make the shade less real." Annie sat back. "You always know how to say things that hurt and help at the same time. That's motherhood." By evening, the story had spread across Atlanta. Local news stations picked it up. Then national outlets. The headlines were gentler than Annie expected. But not all of them. Some called it a family tragedy. Some called it a billionaire's reckoning. Some dragged up old photographs of Charles Whitmore Sr., praising his business legacy in one paragraph and questioning it in the next. A few people online accused Ethan of trying to polish his image. Others asked why it had taken so long. Annie stopped reading after 10 minutes. The truth was out, but the world still wanted to chew on it. Ethan returned to Street Mary's that night without cameras, without a large team, and without the hard expression Annie had first seen in the lobby. He carried a folder under one arm and the red toy car in his coat pocket. Annie knew because he touched that pocket when he paused outside room 314. Linda looked up when he entered. "Evening, Ethan." "Miss Carter, you look tired." "I am." "Good. Means you're still human." A faint smile crossed his face. "I've been accused of worse." Annie stood from her chair. "I saw the statement." Ethan nodded. "Did it feel right?" "It felt like a beginning." "That's what it is." He sat, not in Margaret's old chair this time, but in the visitor chair near Linda, as if he was careful not to turn the empty bed into something sacred no one could touch. Grace came in a minute later with Karen Wells from the foundation. Karen carried a slim folder, but she did not open it right away. Linda noticed. "You all brought paperwork again." Karen smiled. "Only the kind we explained first. That's the only kind I tolerate now." Ethan looked at Annie. "This is about the scholarship and your mother's care. Nothing needs to be signed tonight unless you both want to." Annie crossed her arms. "I thought the hospital's support was already handled. Your mother's immediate care, yes. Karen said. This is about long-term support, outpatient treatment after discharge, transportation to appointments, medication gaps, and caregiver relief. Caregiver relief? Annie asked. It means you don't have to be the whole system by yourself, Linda said, looking at her daughter. Karen nodded. Exactly. Annie did not like how fast tears came now. Before Margaret, she had been better at holding things in. Or maybe she had just been too tired to notice they were still there. Ethan opened his folder and took out one page. And this is the scholarship outline. Annie did not reach for it. He placed it on the rolling table instead of pushing it into her hands. Tuition, books, transportation, a living stipend, flexible scheduling support through the college. It will be available to students who are caring for a sick parent or close family member. You would be the first, but not the last. Linda looked at Annie. That sounds like something you would have prayed for if you weren't too stubborn to pray for yourself. Mama. What? I'm in a hospital bed. I'm allowed to say true things. Ethan watched them, and Annie saw something almost tender in his face. Not toward them as strangers, but toward the ordinary rhythm between a mother and daughter. Maybe he was hearing what he had lost. Maybe he was learning not to look away from it. Annie finally picked up the paper. The words looked too official for the thing they promised. Margaret Whitmore Scholarship for Caregiving Students. She read that line twice. My name isn't on it, she said. No, Ethan answered. It shouldn't be. You're not a charity case. You're the reason it exists. Annie looked down. Karen explained the details slowly. Annie asked questions. Linda asked harder ones. Ethan let them. He did not rush. He did not check his phone. When Grace's phone buzzed twice, she silenced it without looking. After half an hour, Linda leaned back, tired but satisfied. I want an independent patient advocate to look at the care documents. Already arranged, Karen said. She can come tomorrow. Linda nodded. Then we'll talk tomorrow. Ethan stood. That's fair. Annie still held the scholarship page. What about school? I've been gone too long. Grace answered. I spoke with the nursing program office. Not about your private situation. Only about readmission timelines. You're still eligible to return next term if you complete the reactivation form. Annie stared at her. Next term? Yes. That's in 6 weeks. Yes. 6 weeks. Annie had measured life in shifts, bills, medication times, and bus transfers. 6 weeks sounded impossible, and close enough to touch. Linda's eyes filled. Baby. Annie pressed her lips together. What if I can't do it? Ethan said. Then you'll have help. What if I fail? Linda answered before he could. Then you'll fail at something that belongs to you. That's better than surviving only what sickness left you. Annie let out a shaky breath. That's not comforting. It isn't supposed to be. It's supposed to be true. Ethan glanced toward Margaret's empty bed. My mother believed you had a future. She said it when she could barely speak. I don't think she would have wasted breath on something she didn't mean. Annie looked at the paper again. For a moment, she saw Margaret's hand, thin and shaking, pushing the envelope toward her. She heard her voice asking for one last favor. She remembered the way Ethan had stood in the lobby, closed off and cruel, and the way he had changed when the truth reached him. Maybe futures were like that too. Closed until someone opened the first door. Annie folded the scholarship outline carefully and put it in her backpack. I'll read it tonight. Linda smiled. That means yes in Annie language. It means I'll read it. Same thing. Ethan did not push. Take your time. Before he left, he walked to the empty bed by the window. He stood there only a moment, then placed one yellow rose on the pillow. Annie had not seen it in his hand before. Linda watched him. You visit her here? Yes, Ethan said. I know she isn't here, but this is where I found her. Linda's voice softened. Then come when you need to. He nodded. At the door, Annie spoke. Ethan? He turned. Your mother would have liked the statement. I hope so. She would have corrected one thing. What? Annie glanced at the yellow rose. She wouldn't have wanted people to remember only what was done to her. She would have wanted them to know she was kind. Ethan looked toward the bed. Then we'll make sure they know. After he left, Annie sat beside Linda and opened the scholarship paper again. The hospital lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed softly. Outside the window, Atlanta moved through the dark. For the first time in months, Annie looked at a piece of paper and did not see a bill, a warning, or a deadline. She saw a door. The independent patient advocate arrived the next morning with reading glasses, a canvas tote, and the calm manner of a woman who had spent years helping families say no to things they did not understand. Her name was Mrs. Denise Holloway. She was in her early 60s, wore a soft gray cardigan, and greeted Linda like they had met at church rather than in a hospital room full of forms. "Miss Carter, I'm here for you," she said, taking the chair beside the bed. "Not the hospital, not the foundation, not Mr. Whitmore. You." Linda liked her immediately. "Good," Linda said, "because people keep handing me papers like I'm supposed to trust ink just because it's printed straight." Mrs. Holloway smiled. "Ink has fooled better people than us." Annie sat near the window with the scholarship packet on her lap. She had read it twice the night before and once again before breakfast. Nothing in it looked like a trap, but that almost made her more nervous. For months, every official envelope had carried bad news: past due notices, insurance limits, appointment changes, medication costs. Now one paper claimed a door could open, and Annie did not know how to step through without feeling guilty. Mrs. Holloway reviewed Linda's care documents line by line. She asked Karen Wells to clarify 2 paragraphs, requested one phrase be rewritten in simpler language, and made sure Linda's consent could be withdrawn at any time. Ethan arrived while they were still reviewing the final page. He did not enter right away. He knocked softly and waited. Linda looked up. "Come in, Ethan. We're making your people work for their signatures. That's what they're paid for," he said. Karen laughed under her breath. Grace, standing by the door, gave the smallest smile. Ethan looked at Annie. "Did you read the scholarship documents?" "Yes." "And?" "I have questions." "Good." That answer unsettled her. She had expected persuasion, not patience. Mrs. Holloway looked over the scholarship packet next. She checked the tuition coverage, living stipend, transportation support, and the clause allowing Annie to pause if Linda's condition worsened. "This is solid," she said at last. "Generous too, but generous doesn't mean careless. You'll still have responsibilities, Annie. Grades, attendance, communication with the program. This is not a free ride. It is a supported road." Annie nodded. "I can handle responsibility." Linda gave a tired snort. "That girl has been handling responsibility since she was 12. Mama, it's true." Ethan sat near the foot of the bed. "What worries you most?" Annie looked at the packet, then at her mother. Leaving her, Linda's expression softened. Annie continued. "Everybody keeps saying school like it's just classes and books. But school means hours I'm not here. It means trusting other people to notice when she needs something. It means not being the one who catches every small change." Linda reached for her hand. "Baby, you are my daughter. You are not my nurse, my doctor, my insurance company, my night staff, and my whole emergency plan. I know that." "No, you don't. You say you do, but you carry me like if you set me down for 5 minutes, love will stop counting." Annie's eyes burned. Ethan looked away, but the words had reached him too. Linda squeezed Annie's hand. "You think staying beside this bed every hour proves you love me? It doesn't. It proves the world didn't give us enough help." Mrs. Holloway nodded. "That is the cleanest truth I've heard all week." Annie tried to laugh, but it came out broken. Ethan leaned forward. "The care plan includes trained support, transportation, home health coordination. If she qualifies for discharge later, you would not be abandoning her." Annie looked at him. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't." "Then don't talk like it is." He accepted that. "You're right. It will be hard. You'll feel guilty. Some days you'll be in class thinking about her instead of the lecture. Some nights you'll wonder if taking help changed who you are. It won't. But I won't lie and tell you courage feels clean while you're living it." Annie studied him. "You sound like someone trying to convince himself too." He glanced toward the empty bed where the yellow rose had begun to open. "Maybe I am." No one spoke for a moment. Then Linda said, "Sign the school papers, Annie." Annie turned quickly. "Mama, no. Listen to me. I am still your mother, and I am telling you I did not raise you so sickness could inherit you." The room went quiet. Linda's voice weakened, but her eyes stayed firm. "You becoming a nurse was never just about a job. It was about who you are. You see people other folks step around. You heard Miss Margaret when the rest of the world had gone deaf. Don't put that gift in a storage box because I got sick. Annie wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. What if something happens while I'm in class? Then someone will call you. What if I'm not here fast enough? Linda looked toward Margaret's bed, then back to Annie. You brought a son to his mother in time. Don't start believing you have to beat every clock God puts in front of you. Annie lowered her head. Ethan did not rush the moment. Grace stayed silent. Karen closed her folder. Mrs. Holloway folded her hands in her lap. At last, Annie picked up the pen. She signed the scholarship acceptance form with a hand that shook only a little. Linda smiled like she had just watched her daughter cross a stage. That's my girl, she whispered. Ethan looked down, and Annie thought for a second he might be thinking of Margaret, of every school form and birthday card she had never been allowed to sign. When the documents were finished, Grace made copies. Karen explained next steps: orientation, reactivation with the nursing program, a meeting with the dean, transportation arrangements, a part-time schedule built around Linda's care needs. Annie listened carefully, asking practical questions because practical questions kept her from crying again. After the others left, Ethan remained. Annie stood near the empty bed, looking at the yellow rose. She made all this happen. Yes, Ethan said. She barely had anything left. She had enough. Annie turned to him. Are you going to be okay? He seemed surprised by the question. I don't know, he said. That's honest. I have a meeting with council this afternoon. Robert's statement is being formalized. There may be lawsuits. There will be articles. People will defend my grandfather. Some will say my mother should have fought harder. Annie's face tightened. That's cruel. It is also predictable. What will you say? That she fought as long as she could against people who had more weapons, and that survival is not the same as surrender. Annie nodded slowly. She'd like that. I hope so. Linda had drifted to sleep. Her breathing was steady. Annie looked at her for a long moment, then picked up the scholarship packet and slid it into her backpack. I used to think help meant I failed, Annie said. So did I. She looked at him. You? My mother tried to reach me for years. I thought needing her meant I was weak, so I learned not to need anyone. People called that strength because it made money. And now? Now I think a child waiting by a window was not weak. He was just lonely. Annie's expression softened. She knew that boy was still in there. Ethan touched the pocket where he kept the red toy car. She saw more than she was allowed to say. A nurse came in to check Linda's vitals, and Ethan stepped back. Annie helped adjust the blanket, then moved aside. The scene was ordinary, but Ethan watched it as if ordinary care had become something sacred to him. When the nurse left, Ethan said, There's one more thing. Annie braced herself. What? The foundation wants to name the first scholarship publicly. I told them not without your permission. My name? Only if you agree. They suggested the Annie Carter Award. No. He nodded immediately. All right, she blinked. That's it? That's it. I thought you'd argue. I'm learning. Annie smiled a little. Good. What would you want instead? She looked at Margaret's empty bed. Name it for her. Just her. It already is. Then that's enough. Let girls like me get help without having to become a headline. Ethan held her gaze. Done. A few hours later, Annie walked Ethan to the elevator. Not because he needed direction anymore, but because neither of them seemed ready for the conversation to end at the room door. As they waited, he said, Orientation is next Monday. I know. You'll go? She looked at the closed elevator doors, seeing herself reflected faintly in the metal, tired eyes, old hoodie, backpack strap worn thin. Still Annie. But not only the Annie who had slept in a chair. I'll go. The elevator opened. Ethan stepped inside, then turned. My mother was right about you. Annie swallowed. She was right about you too. It just took you longer. For once, he did not look wounded by the truth. He nodded, and the doors closed. Annie walked back to room 314 with the scholarship papers in her backpack and fear still sitting in her chest, but beneath it was something she had not felt in a long time. Not certainty. Hope. The following Monday, Annie stood outside the nursing building with her backpack on one shoulder and her acceptance folder pressed against her chest. Atlanta Community College did not look grand. The brick walls were plain, the sidewalks uneven in places, and a group of students sat on a low wall eating breakfast from paper bags while someone complained about parking. But to Annie, the building might as well have been a gate opening after a long winter. She arrived 30 minutes early because fear had woken her before the alarm. Linda had insisted on helping her choose a clean blouse and had made Annie sit still while she brushed a piece of lint from her shoulder. "You look like a nurse already," Linda had said from her hospital bed. "I'm not even through orientation. Doesn't matter. I can see where you're headed." Annie had tried to smile, but her throat tightened. Leaving the hospital that morning had been harder than she expected. Linda's new care plan had started. A home health coordinator had been assigned for when discharge became possible. A nurse would check on her during Annie's class hours. There were phone numbers taped beside the bed, transportation forms in a folder, and Mrs. Holloway's card tucked inside Annie's wallet. Still, when Annie stepped onto the bus, guilt sat beside her like another passenger. Now she stood on campus, watching students walk in with coffee cups, notebooks, earbuds, and the easy irritation of people whose lives had not recently been rearranged by a dying woman's letter. Annie envied them for a second. Then she remembered what Linda had said. "I did not raise you so sickness could inherit you." She took a breath and walked inside. The orientation room was on the second floor. A woman at the front table checked her name and handed her a packet. "Annie Carter?" "Yes, ma'am." "Welcome back, Annie." The words were simple. Annie almost cried anyway. She chose a seat near the middle, not in the back where she could disappear, and not in the front where she felt too exposed. Other students came in, some older than her, some with wedding rings, some with tired eyes she recognized. A woman in her 40s sat beside her and smiled. "First day nerves?" the woman asked. "That obvious?" "Honey, I'm holding my pen like it might run away." Annie laughed, and the sound surprised her. The program director began by talking about schedules, clinical hours, attendance, study groups, and the seriousness of patient care. Annie took notes carefully. Her handwriting was smaller than usual because her hand wanted to shake. When the director mentioned that nursing was not only science but attention, Annie looked down. Attention. That was how it had all started. A blanket on the floor. An empty cup. A woman everyone had walked past. During the break, Annie checked her phone. There was a message from Linda. "I'm fine." Nurse came. "Eat lunch. Do not call me every 10 minutes." Annie smiled through wet eyes. Another message waited below it. "Ethan, your mother is doing well this morning. Margaret would be proud of you." Annie stared at the words for a while before typing back. "Thank you. I made it to orientation." His reply came a minute later. "I never doubted you would." Annie slid the phone into her backpack before she could overthink the kindness in that sentence. Across town, Ethan Whitmore stood in a conference room at Whitmore Industries with Grace beside him and outside counsel on the screen. The public review of his family's records had begun. Robert Hale's full statement had been filed. More documents were still being sorted. More names still surfacing. It would be messy. Grace had warned him that some board members were nervous. Ethan had looked at her and said, "They should be." Now, on the long table before him, there were two objects he had refused to send to storage: Margaret's first letter and the red toy car. One of the attorneys was speaking about reputational damage. Ethan listened until the phrase came up for the third time. "Let me stop you there," he said. The room went quiet. "My mother's reputation was damaged for 40 years. We can survive a few uncomfortable headlines." Grace looked down at her notes, but he saw the corner of her mouth move. Later that afternoon, Ethan went back to St. Mary's. He had started doing that without announcing it. Not every day, but often enough that the nurses no longer looked surprised when he appeared near room 314 or the small chapel downstairs. Linda was sitting up when he arrived, eating soup and making a face at it. "That bad?" Ethan asked from the doorway. Linda looked up. "This soup has no memory of seasoning. I'll file a complaint. You do that. Put your billionaire weight behind black pepper." He smiled and stepped in. The bed beside the window now held a new patient, an elderly man sleeping with the television on low. Room 314 had changed again, but not completely. A small framed photograph of yellow roses sat on the windowsill. Annie had brought it in after Margaret's service. The nurses had allowed it to stay. "How was she this morning?" Linda asked. "Annie?" Linda gave him a look. "No, Ethan. The mayor." "Of course, Annie. She made it to orientation." Linda closed her eyes. and the relief on her face was quiet but deep. Good. She was afraid. She went anyway. Yes, that's courage. People keep thinking courage feels like confidence. Most times it feels like nausea and bus fare. Ethan sat down, laughing softly. You and Annie both have a way of saying things people should write down. She got it from me. I'm beginning to suspect that. Linda looked at him for a moment. And you? How are you carrying all this? He did not answer with a polite lie. Linda would have seen through it. Badly some days. That's normal. I keep thinking of what I would say to her if I had one more hour. Linda's face softened. You did say enough for her to leave in peace. I hope so. She heard you call her mom. Trust me, she took that with her. Ethan looked toward the window. I wish she had known sooner that I didn't hate her at the end. She knew enough. The words stayed with him. Weeks passed. Annie's life did not become easy. That was not how real help worked. She still woke early, still visited Linda between classes, still studied on buses and in hospital waiting areas. She learned medical terminology, practiced taking blood pressure, memorized infection control steps, and discovered that anatomy did not care how tired she was. But now there were meals she did not have to skip. There were rides arranged when the bus schedule failed. There was a chair for her in the student lounge, a used laptop from the scholarship program, and a professor who knew her name. Some days she still panicked. Some nights Linda had pain, and Annie sat beside her bed with flashcards in one hand and her mother's fingers in the other. But she was no longer carrying everything alone. The Margaret Whitmore Scholarship received its first group of applicants before the semester ended. Annie refused to speak at the announcement, but she agreed to stand in the back of the room while Ethan explained why the scholarship existed. He did not mention Annie by name until the end, and only after she had agreed. This fund began because one young woman saw someone others had overlooked, he said. Not because she had power, but because she had mercy. My mother's name is on this scholarship, but her lesson belongs to all of us. Do not let the person with the quietest voice become the easiest to ignore. Annie stood in the back with Linda, who had been discharged 2 weeks earlier into a supervised outpatient plan. Linda used a cane now and moved slowly. But she was there. When the room applauded, she leaned toward Annie. You better stand up straight. I didn't put lotion on your elbows for you to shrink in public. Annie laughed, then cried, then laughed again. After the event, Ethan found them near the hallway. You did well, Linda told him. I had a good teacher. Linda raised an eyebrow. Your mama? He nodded. And your daughter? Annie looked away. I didn't teach you anything. You taught me to open a letter I didn't want to read. That's a strange lesson. It saved me anyway. A year later, on a mild spring morning, Annie walked into St. Mary's General wearing student scrubs for her first clinical rotation. The hospital looked the same. Busy lobby. Tired families, coffee smell. Elevator doors opening and closing. Nurses moving like they knew the value of seconds. But Annie entered differently. She was still nervous. Her badge still felt too new. Yet when she passed room 314, she stopped. The door was open. A new patient slept inside. A daughter sat beside the bed, looking exhausted. One hand curled around a paper cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Annie saw herself. She stepped in quietly and asked, Ma'am, do you need some water? The woman looked up, surprised by the kindness. Yes, she said. Thank you. Annie filled the cup, adjusted the tray, and smiled. Someone did that for me once, the woman said, though she did not know Annie had done it first. Annie looked toward the window where afternoon light touched the sill. For a moment, she imagined Margaret there, smiling with those tired eyes that had still known how to see people clearly. Outside the room, her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. Your mother says you forgot your lunch. I'm told this is a serious offense. Annie smiled and typed back. Tell her I'll eat after rounds. A second reply came. She said no, you won't. She also said Margaret would agree with her. Annie laughed softly. Then she put the phone away and stepped back into the hall. Life had not returned to what it was before Margaret. It had become something else. Linda was still healing. Ethan was still repairing what his family had broken. Annie was still learning how to hold hope without fearing it would be taken away. But Margaret's letter had done what she had asked of it. It had reached her son. It had broken a lie. It had opened a future for a girl who had almost given hers away. And in the quiet work of Annie's hands, in the fund that carried Margaret's name, In the red toy car Ethan kept on his office shelf, her love continued moving through the world. Some people leave money, some people leave houses, but the strongest people leave courage for the living. The lesson of this story is that we should never judge someone's pain from the outside. A poor young woman, a lonely mother, and a cold billionaire were all carrying burdens no one could see at first. Annie's kindness proved that even the smallest act of care can change the course of many lives. Margaret's letter showed that truth may be delayed, hidden, or buried by powerful people, but it still matters when it finally reaches the right heart. And Ethan's journey reminds us that forgiveness does not erase the past, but it can stop the past from destroying the future. In the end, the story teaches us to listen before we judge, to help before we are asked, and to remember that quiet compassion can be stronger than wealth, pride, or years of anger. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.